From the misty Alps to sun-drenched Sicily, Italy was never one nation, but rather a complex mosaic of competing powers, brilliant innovations and enduring traditions that would shape Western civilization forever. Before we journey through medieval Italy together, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment below, where are you from and what time are you watching? The fall of the Western Empire, 476-493. The year was 476 CE. The last Roman emperor in the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, sat upon a throne that had lost all meaning. His name carried cruel irony. Romulus, after Rome's legendary founder, and Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. The empire that had once stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia now barely controlled central Italy. Germanic chieftain Odoacer commanded the imperial armies. Roman senators still met in their ancient halls. The aqueducts still carried water to Rome's fountains. Odoacer was not a barbarian destroyer, but a pragmatic ruler who understood Roman ways. He had served in the imperial army for decades. His soldiers were mostly Germanic, but they had grown up within Roman borders. They spoke Latin alongside their native tongues. They knew Roman law and Roman customs. When Odoacer deposed the young emperor, he did not proclaim himself ruler of a new kingdom. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. He declared himself Rex, or king, but ruled as the Eastern Emperor's representative. The transition was remarkably peaceful. Roman aristocrats kept their estates. The Senate continued to function. Roman law remained in force throughout the peninsula. Coins still bore imperial symbols. Latin remained the language of government and education. The Catholic Church maintained its growing influence. Pope Felix III corresponded with both Germanic rulers and Byzantine officials. Trade continued along ancient routes. Merchants from Constantinople still sailed to Italian ports, yet change was unmistakable beneath this surface continuity. Germanic warriors settled on Roman estates. They brought their own customs and traditions. Roman villa owners found themselves hosting foreign guests who became permanent neighbours. These newcomers adopted Roman dress and Roman names. They married Roman women. Their children learned Latin as their first language. A new culture was slowly emerging, neither purely Roman nor Germanic, but something entirely new. The Italian peninsula had become a patchwork of different authorities. Odoacer controlled the north from his capital at Ravenna. Byzantine officials still governed Sicily and southern Italy. The Pope ruled growing territories around Rome. Various Germanic tribes held scattered strongholds throughout the countryside. This fragmentation would define Italian history for the next 1,000 years. The Ostrogothic kingdom, 493-503, in 489 a new player arrived on the Italian stage. Theodoric the Great led his Ostrogothic people across the Alps. The Eastern Emperor Zeno had commissioned this migration. He wanted Theodoric to remove Odoacer and establish a more reliable government in Italy. The Gothic War lasted 4 years. Ravenna finally surrendered in 493. Theodoric invited Odoacer to a peace banquet and killed him with his own hands. The Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy had begun. Theodoric proved to be one of history's most enlightened barbarian rulers. He established his capital at Ravenna, where magnificent mosaics still gleamed in the desert sun. The city became a bridge between East and West, between Christian and classical cultures. Theodoric's palace complex rivaled Constantinople's in splendor. Marble columns supported intricate arches. Gold Torcelli caught the morning light in countless tiny reflections. Here, Gothic warriors walked beside Roman senators in halls decorated with both Christian symbols and classical motifs. The Ostrogothic king understood that his people were vastly outnumbered by Romans. Wisdom lay in accommodation, not domination. He preserved Roman law for Roman citizens while allowing Goths to live under their ancestral customs. Roman aristocrats retained their positions in government. The Senate continued to meet and debate. Roman schools taught classical literature alongside Christian texts. Greek remained the language of learning in southern Italy. Latin served as the common tongue of administration. Theodoric's building program transformed Italy. He restored aqueducts that had fallen into disrepair. Roads received attention after decades of neglect. New churches rose in Rome, Ravenna, and Milan. The king commissioned both secular and religious architecture. His tomb in Ravenna, constructed from enormous blocks of Istrian stone, demonstrated Gothic engineering skill. Its dome, carved from a single piece of stone, weighed 300 tons. Yet the building's design showed clear Roman influences in its proportions and decorative elements. Culture flourished under Theodoric's protection. The philosopher Boethius served as consul and wrote his immortal Consolation of Philosophy in a Roman prison. Cassiodorus, the king's secretary, preserved countless classical texts that would otherwise have vanished. Symmachus translated Greek works into Latin. The historian Jordanes chronicled Gothic origins and achievements. These scholars created a cultural synthesis that enriched both Germanic and Roman traditions. Relations with Constantinople remained complex throughout Theodoric's reign. He acknowledged the Eastern Emperor's theoretical supremacy while maintaining practical independence. Marriage alliances linked the Gothic royal family to other Germanic kingdoms. Theodoric's daughter married the Visigothic king in Spain. His sister became Queen of the Vandals in North Africa. These connections created a web of alliances that balanced Byzantine influence. Economic prosperity returned to Italy under Gothic rule. Trade revived along Mediterranean routes. Italian merchants ventured to Constantinople, Alexandria, and Carthage. Agricultural production increased as peace allowed farmers to work their fields without fear. The population began to recover from centuries of warfare and invasion. Towns that had shrunk during the chaotic 5th century started to grow again. The Gothic Wars and Byzantine reconquest, 30 vs. 53. Emperor Justinian I dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its ancient glory. From his palace in Constantinople, he gazed westward toward territories once ruled by his predecessors. Italy beckoned as the greatest prize. In 535, he launched the campaign that would devastate the peninsula for nearly 20 years. Byzantine armies under Belisarius landed in Sicily and southern Italy. The Gothic Wars had begun. Belisarius was a military genius whose campaigns read like adventure stories. His small but disciplined army moved swiftly through southern Italy. Gothic garrisons surrendered or withdrew northward. The general's reputation for clemency encouraged Italian cities to open their gates. Rome itself fell to Belisarius in 536 after a siege that lasted only 20 days. The Eternal City welcomed its liberators with cautious optimism. King Vitiz rallied Gothic resistance from Ravenna. His army was larger than the Byzantine force, but lacked the discipline and tactical sophistication of Justinian's professionals. The Goths excelled in individual combat, but struggled with complex maneuvers. Their cavalry could charge with devastating effect, but Byzantine mounted archers struck from distance and withdrew before the enemy could respond. These tactical differences proved decisive in battle after battle. The siege of Rome in 537–538 became the war's turning point. Vitiges surrounded the city with a vast Gothic army estimated at 150,000 men. Belisarius commanded fewer than 5,000 defenders. The siege lasted 374 days. Food ran short. Disease struck both armies. Ancient aqueducts were cut, leaving parts of Rome without water. Yet the city's massive walls, built by Aurelian 3 centuries earlier, proved impregnable to Gothic assault. Belisarius demonstrated his tactical brilliance during the siege. He armed Roman civilians and posted them on the walls to create an impression of greater numbers. Byzantine cavalry made sudden sorties that disrupted Gothic camps. The general's engineers restored damaged sections of the walls under cover of darkness. When Gothic forces attempted to storm the city through damaged aqueducts, they found the passages blocked and defended by determined soldiers. The arrival of Byzantine reinforcements finally broke the siege. Vitiz withdrew his army northward, but the long campaign had exhausted Gothic resources. Many Gothic nobles began negotiations with Constantinople. Some switched sides entirely, bringing their followers into Byzantine service. The Gothic kingdom was fragmenting under military pressure and political discord. Narses replaced Belisarius as Byzantine commander in 552. His approach differed markedly from his predecessors. Where Belisarius had been bold and improvisational, Narses was methodical and thorough. He brought a larger army and more resources. Most importantly, he possessed imperial authority to make political settlements without consulting Constantinople. The final Gothic resistance collapsed at the Battle of Mons Lactarius in 553. The war's cost was catastrophic. Italy's population had already declined during the 5th century. Now it plummeted further. Entire regions became almost uninhabited. Cities shrank to small settlements huddled within ancient walls. The Roman aristocracy, which had survived Odoacer and Theodoric, was largely destroyed. Their villas lay in ruins, their libraries were scattered or burned. The cultural synthesis achieved under Gothic rule lay shattered. Economic devastation accompanied demographic collapse. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries were disrupted. Manufacturing centres stood abandoned. Agricultural production fell dramatically as farms were destroyed and farmers fled or died. The elaborate system of Roman roads required constant maintenance, but resources were lacking. Infrastructure decay accelerated throughout the peninsula. The Lombard invasion and settlement 568-774. 3 years after Narses completed his conquest, new invaders crossed the Alps. The Lombards came not as imperial allies but as independent conquerors seeking new homes. King Alboin led perhaps 100,000 people, warriors, farmers, craftsmen, and their families, across the mountain passes in 568. They found an Italy weakened by decades of warfare and ready for yet another transformation. The Lombard conquest differed fundamentally from earlier Germanic invasions. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals had sought accommodation with Roman populations. They preserved existing institutions while establishing their own authority. The Lombards showed little interest in Roman law or Roman customs. They came as conquerors who intended to replace, not absorb, the civilization they found. Alban's advance was remarkably swift. Lombard warriors swept across the Po Valley, capturing city after city. Milan fell without serious resistance. Pavia became the capital after a 3-year siege. Only a few fortified centres held out against the invasion. The Byzantines retained control of Ravenna and the surrounding coastal regions. Rome remained under imperial authority, though increasingly isolated. A narrow corridor of territory connected the capital to Byzantine ports in central Italy. Lombard society was fundamentally different from Roman civilization. They were a warrior people who valued martial prowess above all else. Land ownership was their primary source of wealth and status. Their laws, preserved in written form, dealt primarily with compensation for injuries and procedures for settling disputes. Family honor was paramount. Blood feuds could continue for generations unless resolved through elaborate rituals of payment and reconciliation. Religious differences complicated Lombard rule over Roman populations. Most Lombards followed Arian Christianity, which Romans considered heretical. The invaders built their own churches and appointed their own clergy. Catholic bishops found themselves under suspicion or outright hostility. Some fled to Byzantine territories. Others accommodated themselves to Lombard rule while maintaining secret communications with Rome and Constantinople. Conversion to Catholic Christianity began slowly but accelerated over time. Queen Theodelinda, Alboin's successor's wife, embraced Catholicism and encouraged others to follow her example. She corresponded with Pope Gregory the Great and sponsored church construction. The Iron Crown of the Lombard kings created during her reign symbolized the merger of Germanic warrior tradition with Christian kingship. Its circle of gold contained a band of iron allegedly forged from a nail used in Christ's crucifixion. The papacy found itself in an increasingly difficult position. Lombard expansion threatened the remaining Byzantine territories that protected Rome. Pope Gregory I negotiated directly with Lombard dukes when imperial officials proved ineffective. He ransomed prisoners, distributed grain during famines, and even concluded temporary truces. The Pope was becoming a temporal ruler by necessity, a development that would shape medieval history profoundly. Lombard culture gradually absorbed Roman and Christian influences. Their original language disappeared as Latin became universal. Roman building techniques influenced Lombard architecture. Christian symbols appeared on Lombard coins and decorative objects. Intermarriage between Lombards and Romans created a new population that was neither Germanic nor Roman but distinctly Italian. Economic recovery began slowly under Lombard rule. Agricultural production stabilized as warfare diminished. New settlements appeared in previously abandoned areas. Trade routes reopened under Lombard protection. The kings minted coins that circulated throughout their territories. Urban centres began to revive, though they remained much smaller than their ancient predecessors. The Lombard period established patterns that would define medieval Italy. Political fragmentation became the norm rather than the exception. Local strongmen exercised authority within their territories, while acknowledging distant superiors. The Catholic Church emerged as a major landowner and political force. Cultural synthesis created new forms of art, law, and social organization that blended Germanic, Roman, and Christian elements. By 774, the Lombard kingdom had endured for over 2 centuries. Its people had created a distinctive civilization that was recognizably Italian rather than Germanic. They had survived Byzantine attempts at reconquest and internal divisions that threatened royal authority. Yet their independence would soon end when Charlemagne's Frankish armies crossed the Alps. The age of foreign intervention in Italian affairs was about to begin in earnest. The twilight of Rome had ended. The dawn of new kingdoms had given way to centuries of transformation and synthesis. Italy emerged from this period as a land of infinite variety, unified by culture and faith, divided by politics and geography, enriched by the contributions of many peoples who had chosen to make the peninsula their home, the papacy as temporal power, 590-750, as the Lombard kingdom consolidated its power across northern Italy. Another force was quietly emerging in the Eternal City. The Bishop of Rome had always held spiritual authority over Christian communities, but circumstances would soon transform the papacy into a temporal power that rivaled kings and emperors. The man who began this transformation was Gregory, later called the Great, who became pope in 590 during one of Rome's darkest hours. Gregory inherited a city ravaged by plague, flood, and economic collapse. The Tiber had risen to unprecedented levels, destroying grain stores and leaving thousands homeless. Disease swept through overcrowded neighborhoods where refugees from Lombard conquests had sought shelter. The imperial administration was largely defunct. Byzantine officials could barely maintain order in their own districts. Someone had to take responsibility for feeding the population and defending the city. The new pope possessed both the vision and administrative skills necessary for this enormous task. He had served as prefect of Rome before entering religious life, giving him intimate knowledge of urban administration. His family owned vast estates in Sicily that provided him with independent resources. Most importantly, he understood that spiritual authority meant nothing if people were starving or living in fear. Gregory organized Rome's defense when Lombard armies approached the city. He negotiated directly with Lombard dukes, while Byzantine officials remained safely behind their walls. The Pope ransomed prisoners with church funds. He distributed grain to the poor from papal granaries. His letters, which survive in remarkable numbers, reveal a man who had become ruler of Rome in all but name. The papal administration expanded rapidly under Gregory's leadership. The Church owned extensive properties throughout Italy and beyond. These estates required careful management to provide revenue for charitable works and administrative expenses. Gregory appointed capable administrators who answered directly to him. They collected rents, supervised agricultural operations, and transported goods to Roman markets. The papacy was becoming a major economic power. Missionary activities flourished under Gregory's direction. He sent Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. Monks carried the gospel to Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube. These missions created networks of communication and influence that extended papal authority far beyond Italy. Foreign kings sought the Pope's blessing for their conquests. Bishops throughout Europe acknowledged Roman supremacy in religious matters. Gregory's relationship with Constantinople grew increasingly strained over time. The Eastern Emperor claimed authority over all Christians, including the Bishop of Rome. Gregory acknowledged imperial political power while asserting his spiritual independence. He refused to accept the Patriarch of Constantinople's claim to be universal bishop. This theological dispute reflected deeper tensions about papal authority that would eventually lead to permanent schism. The Pope's correspondence with Lombard rulers reveals his diplomatic skills and political realism. He understood that outright confrontation would be disastrous for Rome's small Christian population. Instead, he cultivated relationships with individual Lombard nobles who might protect papal interests. He encouraged their conversion to Catholic Christianity. He mediated disputes between rival claimants to ducal titles. The papacy was learning to survive and thrive in a world of competing powers. Gregory's successors continued his policies of temporal involvement and spiritual reform. Pope Martin had defied Emperor Constans II over theological questions and was arrested and exiled to the Crimea, where he died in 655. This martyrdom enhanced papal prestige throughout the West, while demonstrating the dangers of opposing Byzantine authority. Later popes learned to be more cautious in their dealings with Constantinople, while maintaining their independence in Italian affairs. The Lombard threat remained constant throughout the 7th and early 8th centuries. Kings Rothari and Liutprand extended their authority southward, threatening Rome itself on several occasions. The papacy survived through diplomacy, bribery, and appeals to distant powers for assistance. Papal territories expanded gradually as local nobles donated lands or placed themselves under church protection. The Duchy of Rome became a reality, though its borders remained fluid and contested. Monastic reform became another source of papal influence during this period. The Benedictine rule, written at Monte Cassino, provided a model for religious communities throughout Europe. Popes granted privileges and protection to reformed monasteries. These institutions became centres of learning and agricultural innovation. Their libraries preserved classical texts that would otherwise have vanished. Their schools trained clergy who carried papal influence to distant regions. The iconoclastic controversy that erupted in Constantinople during the 8th century further strained relations between East and West. Emperor Leo III banned religious images throughout the Byzantine Empire. Pope Gregory II refused to accept this policy in papal territories. Italian bishops supported their pope against imperial religious innovation. This dispute weakened Byzantine authority in Italy, while strengthening papal independence. By 750, the papacy had become a major player in Italian politics. Popes ruled territories that extended from Rome to the Adriatic coast. They commanded armies and navies. They negotiated treaties with foreign powers. They collected taxes and administered justice. The transformation from purely spiritual to temporal authority was complete, though many challenges lay ahead. The Carolingian intervention, 754-800, north of the Alps. A new power was rising that would reshape the political landscape of Western Europe. The Frankish kingdom under the Carolingian dynasty had conquered Gaul and was expanding eastward into Germanic territories. King Pepin the Short faced a legitimacy crisis. His family had deposed the last Merovingian king, but royal blood did not flow in Carolingian veins. The papacy would provide the solution to this problem in exchange for protection against Lombard expansion. Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps in 754 to meet Pepin at the royal palace of Pontillon. This was the first time a pope had travelled north of the mountains to seek foreign assistance. The meeting was carefully orchestrated for maximum symbolic effect. Stephen anointed Pepin and his sons as legitimate kings of the Franks. In return, Pepin promised to protect papal territories and recover lands seized by the Lombards. The donation of Pepin that followed this agreement created the legal foundation for papal temporal power. The Frankish king conquered Lombard territories in central Italy and granted them to the Pope in perpetuity. These lands became the Papal States, an independent principality that would survive until Italian unification in 1870. The papacy now possessed both the spiritual authority of St. Peter's successor and the temporal power of a sovereign ruler. Pepin's Italian campaigns demonstrated Frankish military superiority over Lombard forces. Frankish heavy cavalry proved decisive in battle after battle. Their weapons and armour were superior to anything the Lombards could produce. Most importantly, the Franks fought as a unified army under royal command, while Lombard forces remained divided among competing dukes who often pursued their own interests. The Lombard king Aistulf had threatened Rome itself before Pepin's intervention. His armies camped outside the city's walls. Papal envoys had pleaded desperately for Byzantine assistance, but Constantinople was preoccupied with iconoclastic controversies and Arab invasions. The Eastern Empire could no longer protect its Italian territories effectively. The papacy had no choice but to seek new protectors in the west. Charlemagne inherited his father's Italian interests when he became sole Frankish king in 771. The new ruler was more ambitious than Pepin and possessed greater resources for sustained military campaigns. When Lombard king Desiderius renewed attacks on papal territories, Charlemagne responded with overwhelming force. His army crossed the Alps in 773 and besieged Pavia, the Lombard capital. The siege lasted 10 months. Desiderius had strengthened the city's fortifications and stockpiled provisions for a long defence. Lombard hopes rested on Frankish impatience. Previous foreign armies had withdrawn when faced with determined resistance. But Charlemagne was no ordinary invader. He maintained the siege through winter while sending detachments to conquer other Lombard strongholds. Pavia finally surrendered in June 774. Charlemagne entered the city in triumph and proclaimed himself King of the Lombards and Patrician of the Romans. The Lombard kingdom that had dominated northern Italy for over 2 centuries was extinct. Its last king spent his remaining years in a Frankish monastery. Lombard nobles who submitted to Frankish rule retained their lands and positions. Those who resisted faced exile or death. Charlemagne's conquest was remarkably thorough and permanent. Unlike previous invaders who had adopted Italian customs, the Franks imposed their own administrative systems and cultural practices. They introduced Frankish law alongside existing Roman and Lombard codes. Frankish nobles received Italian estates and built castles to control the countryside. The fusion of Germanic and Italian traditions continued under new management. The relationship between Charlemagne and the papacy remained complex despite their alliance against the Lombards. The Frankish king respected papal spiritual authority, but insisted on his own supremacy in temporal matters. He appointed bishops and abbots throughout his Italian territories. He summoned church councils and defined religious policies. The Pope retained independence within his own states, but accepted Frankish protection and guidance in broader matters. Christmas Day 800 witnessed one of history's most significant ceremonies. Charlemagne knelt in prayer at St. Peter's tomb when Pope Leo III approached with a golden crown. The Pope placed the crown on the Frankish king's head while the Roman crowd acclaimed him as emperor. Whether this coronation was planned or spontaneous remains debated, but its implications were enormous. The revival of the Western Roman Empire challenged Byzantine claims to universal authority. Constantinople had regarded itself as the sole heir to Roman legitimacy since 476. Now a barbarian king wore the imperial crown and ruled from territories that had once been the empire's heartland. The pope who performed the coronation clearly believed he possessed the authority to create emperors, a claim that would cause centuries of conflict. Charlemagne's reaction to his coronation was reportedly one of surprise and displeasure. He supposedly said he would never have entered the church if he had known what Leo intended. This claim may have been diplomatic. The new emperor needed to avoid provoking Byzantine retaliation while establishing his legitimacy in Western eyes. The coronation created a new political order that would dominate European history for centuries. The Carolingian Kingdom of Italy, 800–887. The establishment of Carolingian rule in Italy brought fundamental changes to the peninsula's administrative, economic and cultural life. Charlemagne organized his Italian territories as a separate kingdom within his empire, appointing his son Pepin as King of Italy in 781. This arrangement acknowledged Italian distinctiveness while maintaining imperial unity. The kingdom included all former Lombard territories plus Frankish conquests in central Italy. Carolingian administration combined efficiency with respect for local customs. Frankish officials called missi dominici travelled throughout Italy to ensure imperial commands were obeyed. They held regular assemblies where local nobles and clergy could present grievances. Royal capitularies established uniform legal standards while preserving elements of Roman, Lombard and Frankish law. This legal pluralism reflected Italy's diverse heritage and practical governance needs. The Carolingians introduced their feudal system to Italy, though it adapted to local conditions. Land grants called benefices were distributed to loyal followers in exchange for military service. Italian nobles who submitted to Frankish rule often retained their estates by accepting feudal obligations. New Frankish settlers received grants of conquered territory. This system created networks of personal loyalty that strengthened royal authority while rewarding service. Economic revival accelerated under Carolingian rule. The empire's vast extent created new opportunities for Italian merchants. Trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare reopened under imperial protection. Frankish silver flowed into Italian markets, stimulating commerce and manufacturing. Agricultural production increased as monasteries introduced new farming techniques. Population growth resumed after centuries of decline. Monastic reform flourished under Carolingian patronage. The emperor established new monasteries and reformed existing communities according to the Benedictine rule. These institutions became centres of learning and cultural preservation. Their schools trained clergy and administrators for royal service. Their scriptoria copied classical texts and Christian writings. Libraries at Monte Cassino, Bobbio, and other monasteries preserved knowledge that would otherwise have vanished. The Carolingian Renaissance reached its full flowering in Italy during the early 9th century. Palace schools attracted scholars from throughout Europe. They studied Latin literature, theology, and the liberal arts. Alcuin of York established educational curricula that would influence European schooling for centuries. Italian scholars like Paul the Deacon contributed to this cultural renewal while preserving their own traditions. Architecture evolved dramatically under Carolingian influence. The empire's resources allowed for ambitious building projects. New churches incorporated Frankish architectural elements while maintaining Italian characteristics. The Abbey Church at San Vincenzo al Volturno demonstrated this synthesis with its innovative combination of Carolingian planning and Italian decorative traditions. Frescoes and mosaics created during this period show remarkable artistic achievement. Charlemagne's successors continued his Italian policies with varying degrees of success. Emperor Louis the Pious maintained unity within the empire but faced rebellions from his sons who demanded their own kingdoms. The Italian nobility generally supported imperial authority because it provided stability and prosperity. Trade continued to flourish. Cultural achievements reached new heights. The future seemed bright for Carolingian Italy. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 partitioned Charlemagne's empire among his grandsons. Lothairi received Italy along with a narrow strip of territory extending northward to the North Sea. This Middle Kingdom was inherently unstable, because it lacked natural boundaries and contained diverse populations with conflicting interests. Italian nobles found themselves involved in disputes that had little relevance to their own concerns. Relations with the papacy remained generally positive throughout the Carolingian period. Popes appreciated imperial protection against external enemies and internal disorder. They collaborated with emperors in church reform and missionary activities. However, tensions arose over the extent of imperial authority in religious matters. The pseudo-Isidorian decretals, forged documents that enhanced papal authority, reflected growing clerical resistance to lay control over church affairs. The empire's eastern frontiers required constant military attention that drained Italian resources. Hungarian raids penetrated deeply into Carolingian territory during the late 9th century. Arab pirates attacked Italian coasts while Saracen armies conquered Sicily and established footholds on the mainland. The emperors struggled to defend their vast territories with increasingly limited resources. Internal discord weakened Carolingian authority as the 9th century progressed. Noble families pursued their own interests rather than imperial policy. Regional differences became more pronounced as central control weakened. The Italian nobility began to question the benefits of foreign rule when emperors could no longer provide effective protection against external enemies. The collapse and fragmentation, 887-1000. The deposition of Emperor Charles the Fat in 87 marked the effective end of Carolingian unity. Italy found itself without imperial government for the first time in over a century. The kingdom's great nobles gathered to elect a new ruler, but their choice revealed the fundamental changes that Carolingian rule had produced. They selected Berengar of Friuli, a descendant of Charlemagne who represented continuity with the imperial past, while being Italian by birth and culture. Berengar's election began a period of violent competition for the Italian crown that would last for centuries. Multiple claimants appeared, each supported by different factions among the nobility. Guy of Spoleto seized Rome and had himself crowned emperor by the Pope. Louis of Provence invaded from the west. Arnulf of Carinthia descended from Germany with claims based on Carolingian inheritance. Italy became a battlefield where foreign armies fought for control of the imperial title. The fragmentation of political authority allowed local strongmen to emerge throughout the peninsula. Marquesses and counts who had governed provinces for the emperors now ruled as independent princes. The Marquis of Tuscany controlled territories from the Alps to the Papal States. The Duke of Spoleto commanded central Italy. Southern nobles established petty kingdoms that acknowledged no superior authority. Feudalism was evolving into something resembling anarchy. Economic disruption accompanied political chaos. Trade routes became unsafe as competing armies demanded tribute from merchants. Agriculture suffered from constant warfare that destroyed crops and scattered farming populations. Urban centres shrank as their populations fled to fortified castles in the countryside. The prosperity that had characterized Carolingian Italy vanished as quickly as it had appeared. External enemies exploited Italian weakness with devastating effect. Hungarian raiders swept across the northern plains, burning monasteries and capturing thousands of slaves. Their swift ponies outmaneuvered Italian heavy cavalry. Their composite bows could penetrate mail armor at distances that made retaliation impossible. Only fortified cities could resist their attacks, and even these sometimes fell to Hungarian siege techniques. Saracen pirates established permanent bases on Italian soil during this period of weakness. They conquered Sicily completely by 902, ending Byzantine rule that had persisted since Justinian's reconquest. Saracen fleets raided Italian coasts from Campania to Liguria. They even attacked Rome itself in 846, plundering St. Peter's Basilica before papal forces could organize effective resistance. Christian shrines throughout Italy paid tribute to avoid similar disasters. The papacy entered what historians call its dark century during this period of political collapse. Popes became pawns in the struggles between Roman noble families who used the papal office to advance their secular interests. Marozia, daughter of the consul Theophylact, controlled papal elections for decades. Her lovers and relatives occupied St. Peter's chair in succession, creating scandals that shocked contemporary observers. Pope Formosus became the central figure in one of this period's most bizarre episodes. After his death in 896, his successor Stephen VI had the corpse exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, and put on trial for various canonical violations. The Cadaver Synod condemned the dead pope and threw his body into the Tiber River. This grotesque ceremony reflected the depths to which papal authority had fallen during the political chaos. Despite these disasters, important developments were occurring beneath the surface of political events. New forms of rural organization were emerging as peasants sought protection from marauding armies. Fortified villages called castelli appeared throughout the countryside. These communities combined agricultural production with military defense. Their inhabitants owed service to local lords who provided protection in exchange for labor and tribute. The rise of castelli represented a fundamental transformation in Italian society. The Roman villa system, which had survived Lombard and Carolingian conquests, finally disappeared as aristocratic families abandoned their country estates for fortified positions. Peasants who had been relatively free under Carolingian law found themselves bound to their lords' lands. Serfdom, which had been uncommon in Italy, became widespread during the 10th century. Monastic communities played crucial roles in preserving civilization during these troubled times. Monasteries maintained schools when secular education collapsed. Their scriptoria continued copying manuscripts while libraries burned around them. Abbots negotiated with competing warlords to protect their communities and their treasures. Some monasteries became virtually independent principalities with their own armies and territories. The Abbey of Cluny, founded in Burgundy in 910, began to influence Italian monasticism during the late 10th century. Cluniac reform emphasized strict observance of the Benedictine rule and independence from lay control. Italian monasteries that adopted these reforms often received papal protection and imperial privileges. The Cluniac movement prepared the ground for the broader church reform movement that would transform medieval Europe. Regional powers began to emerge from the chaos as the 10th century progressed. The Marquesses of Tuscany consolidated their authority over central Italy, while maintaining nominal allegiance to distant emperors. Venice, which had remained under Byzantine protection throughout this period, began expanding its influence along the Adriatic coast. Southern Italy remained fragmented among competing Lombard, Byzantine and Arab rulers. The Otto family of Saxony gradually established their authority over the remnants of the Carolingian Empire north of the Alps. Otto I invaded Italy in 961 to restore imperial authority and was crowned emperor by Pope John X in 962. This marked the beginning of what historians call the Holy Roman Empire, though Otto's control over Italy remained tenuous and required constant military intervention. By the year 1000, Italy had been transformed by more than a century of political fragmentation and foreign invasion. The peninsula remained officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, but real power lay in the hands of local nobles, church officials, and emerging urban communities. The stage was set for the remarkable developments that would make medieval Italy one of Europe's most dynamic and creative regions. The collapse of Carolingian unity had produced chaos and suffering, but it had also created opportunities for new forms of political and social organization. Italian creativity, suppressed during centuries of foreign rule, was about to produce innovations that would influence European development for centuries to come. The age of the communes was dawning. The Ottonian revival, 962–1024, the Saxon kings who emerged from the chaos of the late 9th century brought new energy and purpose to the imperial title. Otto I crossed the Alps in 961 with a disciplined army that bore little resemblance to the fractured forces of the late Carolingian period. His soldiers wore standardized equipment and followed unified commands. Their success against Hungarian raiders had proven Saxon military superiority. Now they would test themselves against Italian political realities. Otto's intervention came at the invitation of Pope John X, who faced threats from Berengar II of Ivrea and his son Adalbert. The papal invitation demonstrated how far the papacy had fallen from its earlier independence. John III was barely 20 years old and had been elected through his family's influence rather than spiritual qualifications. Contemporary chroniclers described him as more interested in hunting and gambling than pastoral duties. Yet his appeal to Otto would have momentous consequences for both Italy and Germany. The emperor's coronation in St. Peter's Basilica on February 2, 962, established the Holy Roman Empire that would dominate European politics for centuries. Otto knelt before the papal altar where Charlemagne had received his crown 162 years earlier. The ceremony followed ancient protocols that emphasized both imperial dignity and Christian humility. The new emperor swore to protect the church and defend papal territories. In return, the pope anointed him as God's chosen ruler in the West. Otto's conception of imperial authority differed markedly from his Carolingian predecessors. The Saxons had no romantic attachments to Roman traditions or Italian culture. They viewed Italy primarily as a source of revenue and imperial prestige. Otto appointed German bishops to Italian sees and granted Italian fiefs to Saxon nobles. This policy created resentment among Italian clerics and aristocrats, who had expected more favourable treatment from their new emperor. The emperor's relationship with Pope John X deteriorated rapidly after the coronation. The young pope had expected Otto to depart for Germany once imperial business was concluded. Instead, the emperor remained in Rome and began investigating papal administration. Otto was shocked by what he discovered. Church revenues were being squandered on personal luxuries. Sacred offices were being sold to the highest bidders. The papal court had become notorious for its moral corruption. Otto summoned a synod that deposed John Dorsin for adultery, perjury, and sacrilege. The assembled bishops elected Leo VIII as his replacement with imperial approval. This action established a precedent for imperial control over papal elections that would cause conflicts for generations. John the Theuthin refused to accept his deposition and returned to Rome with an armed force when Otto departed for Germany. The Pope's restoration lasted only until his death in 964, allegedly while committing adultery. Saxon control over Italy required constant military intervention. Otto returned to the peninsula in 966 to suppress revolts in Rome and southern Italy. His son Otto II spent most of his reign fighting in Italy against Byzantine forces and Arab raiders. These campaigns were expensive and produced limited results. The emperors discovered that Italian revenues, while substantial, could not cover the costs of maintaining imperial authority over such a vast and fractured territory. The renewal of imperial authority brought significant benefits to Italian development. Trade routes reopened under imperial protection. Merchants could travel from the Alps to Rome without fear of arbitrary taxation by local strongmen. Imperial coinage provided a stable medium of exchange that facilitated commerce. Agricultural production increased as peasants could work their fields without constant threats of warfare. Architectural achievements flourished under Ottonian patronage. The emperors commissioned new churches and palaces that demonstrated imperial magnificence. The Cathedral of Magdeburg, though built in Germany, served as a model for Italian projects. Italian craftsmen working on imperial commissions developed new techniques that combined Germanic and Mediterranean traditions. Manuscript illumination reached new heights of sophistication, as imperial scriptoria produced books for the court and major monasteries. Cultural synthesis accelerated during the Ottonian period. German scholars came to Italy to study classical texts preserved in Italian libraries. Italian clerics travelled north to Saxon courts where they encountered different intellectual traditions. This exchange enriched both cultures and prepared the ground for later developments. The monastery of Reichenau became a major centre of learning where German and Italian traditions merged productively. Otto III, who became emperor in 996 at the age of 16, pursued the most ambitious vision of imperial restoration. His mother was Byzantine Princess Theophano, and his tutor was Gerba of Aurillac, one of Europe's most learned scholars. Young Otto dreamed of ruling from Rome as a new Constantine who would unite East and West under Christian imperial authority. He established his court in Rome and adopted Byzantine ceremonial practices that emphasized imperial divinity. The emperor's Roman residence in the Palatine Palace symbolized his commitment to imperial restoration. He surrounded himself with scholars and artists from throughout Europe. His court became a cosmopolitan centre where Greek, Latin and Arabic texts were studied and translated. Otto commissioned new artwork that combined Byzantine, Islamic and Western styles. The Ottonian Renaissance represented a remarkable cultural flowering despite its brief duration. Otto III's early death in 1002 ended Saxon dreams of ruling from Rome. His successor Henry II focused primarily on German affairs, and visited Italy only when absolutely necessary. The imperial title remained important for prestige and legitimacy, but subsequent emperors would rule their Italian territories from north of the Alps. This arrangement suited many Italians who preferred distant oversight to direct imperial administration. The papacy regained some independence during the later Ottonian period. Henry II generally supported papal reform movements and avoided the crude interventions of his predecessors. The emperor recognized that a respected papacy would strengthen imperial authority by providing religious legitimacy. This policy encouraged the growth of reform movements that would eventually challenge imperial control over church appointments. Economic development accelerated throughout Italy during the early 11th century. Population growth resumed after the devastation of the previous century. New agricultural techniques increased productivity. Urban centres began to revive as trade expanded. The Ottonian peace had created conditions for the remarkable developments that would characterize the later Middle Ages. By 1024, when the Ottonian dynasty ended with Henry II's death, Italy had been transformed. The political fragmentation of the 10th century had given way to a more stable, if still complex, system of overlapping authorities. The stage was set for the emergence of new powers that would make Italy the most dynamic region in medieval Europe. The maritime republics rise, 1000–1100, while emperors and popes struggled for supremacy over central Italy. A quiet revolution was occurring in the peninsula's coastal cities. Maritime commerce, which had nearly disappeared during the chaos of the 9th and 10th centuries, began to revive as political stability returned. Italian merchants rediscovered sea routes to Constantinople, Alexandria, and North Africa. Their success would create new forms of government and lay the foundations for Italy's commercial supremacy in the Mediterranean world. Venice occupied a unique position among Italian cities during this period of renewal. The lagoon settlement had remained nominally under Byzantine authority throughout the barbarian invasions and Carolingian conquests. This connection to Constantinople provided Venetian merchants with privileged access to eastern markets. They carried silk, spices, and precious objects westward, while transporting silver, timber, and manufactured goods eastward, along routes their competitors could not access. The relationship between Venice and Byzantium grew increasingly complex as Venetian power expanded. Emperor Basil Seth granted extensive trading privileges to Venetian merchants in 992. These concessions included reduced customs duties and the right to establish commercial quarters in major Byzantine cities. In return, Venice provided naval assistance against Arab pirates and Norman adventurers who threatened imperial territories in southern Italy. Venetian government evolved during this period to meet the needs of a commercial society. The Doge, originally a Byzantine official, became an elected ruler chosen by the city's merchant families. The Great Council included representatives from all major trading houses. Decision-making focused on practical concerns rather than theoretical principles. Laws were designed to facilitate commerce and resolve disputes efficiently. This pragmatic approach would make Venice one of Europe's most stable governments. The city's unique geography contributed significantly to its commercial success. The lagoons provided natural protection against land-based armies. Enemy forces could not approach Venice without boats, and the shallow waters required local knowledge to navigate safely. The city's merchants could pursue aggressive trading policies while remaining secure in their island stronghold. This advantage would prove decisive in Venice's later conflicts with rival Italian cities. Pisa emerged as Venice's major competitor in Mediterranean trade during the early 11th century. The Tuscan city occupied a strategic position at the mouth of the Arno River, providing access to the rich agricultural regions of central Italy. Pisan merchants established trading posts throughout the Mediterranean, while their city's shipbuilders developed new vessel designs that could carry larger cargoes over longer distances. The First Crusade created enormous opportunities for Pisan commerce. Pope Urban II's call for holy war against Muslim control of Jerusalem resonated strongly in Pisa, where merchants had suffered from Arab piracy for generations. The city's fleet transported thousands of crusaders to the east, while establishing permanent trading colonies in captured ports. Pisan merchants obtained privileged status in Antioch, Jerusalem, and other Crusader states. Pisan naval technology advanced rapidly during the crusading period. The city's shipbuilders experimented with new hull designs that improved speed and cargo capacity. They developed improved navigation techniques that allowed year-round sailing in previously dangerous seasons. Pisan galleys combined oars and sails in configurations that provided superior maneuverability in combat. These innovations gave Pisa temporary advantages over its commercial rivals. The city's government adapted to accommodate its expanding maritime interests. Merchant consuls replaced feudal lords as the primary governing authority. These officials were chosen from among the city's most successful traders and served limited terms to prevent corruption. Laws were modified to support commercial activities and resolve international disputes. Pisa was becoming a merchant republic that prioritized trade over traditional aristocratic values. Genoa's rise to maritime prominence came slightly later, but proved more enduring than Pisa's early success. The Ligurian city's harbour was superior to Pisa's river-mouth location. Genoese merchants developed trading relationships throughout the western Mediterranean, while their ships carried pilgrims and crusaders to the Holy Land. The city's bankers created new financial instruments that revolutionized international commerce. Genoese innovations in banking and credit would have lasting impacts on European economic development. The city's merchants developed sophisticated accounting methods that allowed them to track complex international transactions. They created new forms of contracts that shared risks among multiple investors. Most importantly, they pioneered credit systems that allowed merchants to finance trading ventures without carrying large amounts of precious metal across dangerous territories. The establishment of Genoese colonies throughout the Black Sea region provided the city with unique commercial advantages. Genoese merchants reached agreements with Byzantine emperors and local rulers that granted them exclusive trading rights in strategic locations. The colony at Kaffa in the Crimea became a major centre for trade with Russian and Central Asian merchants. These eastern connections would make Genoa enormously wealthy during the later Middle Ages. Amalfi had actually preceded the other maritime republics in commercial development, but its smaller size and limited resources prevented it from maintaining its early advantages. The city had established trade relationships with Muslim rulers in North Africa and Spain during the 10th century, when other Italian cities were still recovering from Hungarian invasions. Amalfi's maritime code, known as the Tavole Amalfitan, provided legal frameworks that other trading cities would later adopt. The Amalfitan merchants' connections to eastern markets provided them with access to luxury goods that commanded high prices in Western Europe. They imported silk, spices, and precious stones while exporting manufactured items and raw materials. Amalfi's favourable location on the Sorrentine Peninsula provided easy access to both Mediterranean trade routes and Italian land transportation networks. The city's decline began during the 11th century as larger rivals captured its traditional markets. Norman conquests in southern Italy disrupted Amalfi's political alliances with local rulers. Pisan and Genoese fleets proved superior in direct competition. The city's merchants lacked the resources to establish permanent colonies in distant locations. Amalfi remained prosperous but could not match the explosive growth of its northern competitors. Competition among the maritime republics intensified throughout the 11th century. Venice and Genoa fought over trading rights in Byzantine territories. Pisa and Genoa battled for control of Corsican and Sardinian resources. These conflicts were primarily commercial rather than territorial, but they involved significant military resources. Naval technology advanced rapidly as each city sought advantages over its rivals. The rise of the maritime republics had profound impacts on Italian society and culture. Merchant families gained wealth and influence that challenged traditional aristocratic dominance. Commercial law evolved to address new forms of business relationships. Urban populations grew as rural people migrated to trading centres seeking economic opportunities. Italian cities began to develop distinctive identities based on commercial rather than feudal principles. International connections established by Italian merchants brought new ideas and technologies to the peninsula. Eastern goods included not only luxury items but also new crops, manufacturing techniques, and scientific knowledge. Arabic numerals and accounting methods revolutionized European commerce. Medical and pharmaceutical knowledge from Islamic sources enhanced European healing practices. The maritime republics were becoming conduits for cultural as well as commercial exchange. The Norman conquest of the south, 1016 to 1194, while northern Italy experienced commercial revival and political experimentation, the southern regions remained fragmented among competing Lombard principalities, Byzantine territories, and Arab emirates. This instability created opportunities for ambitious adventurers willing to risk everything for the chance of winning lands and titles. The Norman knights, who began arriving in southern Italy during the early 11th century, would transform the region into one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated kingdoms. The first Normans reached southern Italy not as conquerors but as hired soldiers. Lombard princes competing for a territorial advantage recruited these formidable warriors whose reputations had spread throughout Europe. Norman heavy cavalry had proven decisive in countless battles north of the Alps. Their disciplined charges could shatter infantry formations and routing enemy armies. Southern Italian rulers believed these military advantages would provide decisive edges in their local conflicts. The Hauteville family, minor Norman nobles from the Cotentin Peninsula, would emerge as the most successful of these adventurers. William Ironarm arrived in Italy around 1035 with a small band of followers seeking military employment. His reputation for courage and tactical skill soon attracted other Norman knights to his banner. What began as mercenary service gradually evolved into territorial conquest as the Hauteville accumulated lands, fortresses, and political influence. Robert Guiscard, William's younger brother, possessed the vision and ruthless determination necessary to create a Norman state in southern Italy. He arrived in Calabria around 1047 and began systematic conquest of Byzantine territories. His methods combined military brilliance with political cunning. Robert negotiated alliances with local rulers, while building a network of loyal followers through generous grants of conquered lands. The siege of Bari in 1071 marked the end of Byzantine rule in mainland Italy. The city had been the centre of imperial administration in the south for over 5 centuries. Its massive walls and strategic location made it virtually impregnable to conventional assault. Robert Guiscard maintained the siege for 3 years, using both military pressure and diplomatic intrigue to weaken the defenders' resolve. The city's surrender removed the last major obstacle to Norman domination of southern Italy. Norman conquest methods differed significantly from earlier barbarian invasions. The newcomers constituted a small elite who ruled over much larger indigenous populations. They preserved existing administrative systems while placing trusted followers in key positions. Greek, Latin, and Arabic continued to serve as official languages depending on local traditions. The Normans demonstrated remarkable cultural adaptability that enhanced their political success. Roger III, Robert Guiscard's youngest brother, conquered Sicily between 1061 and 1091 in one of medieval Europe's most remarkable military campaigns. The island had been under Muslim rule for over 2 centuries and contained numerous fortified cities defended by experienced Arab armies. Roger's smaller Norman force succeeded through superior tactics, local alliances, and relentless determination. The conquest required 30 years of constant warfare. The Norman conquest of Sicily demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of Mediterranean politics. Roger negotiated with Muslim rulers who opposed the island's existing government. He granted favourable terms to cities that surrendered without resistance while severely punishing those that required siege warfare. Christian populations, both Greek and Latin, generally welcomed Norman rule as liberation from Muslim domination despite the conqueror's foreign origins. Roger II, son of Roger the Hun, created the Kingdom of Sicily by uniting his father's island conquest with his cousin's mainland territories. His coronation at Palermo in 1130 established one of medieval Europe's most powerful and sophisticated states. The new kingdom stretched from the Alps to the southern tip of Sicily, and included some of Europe's most prosperous cities and agricultural regions. The Sicilian kingdom under Roger III represented a unique synthesis of Norman, Arab, Byzantine, and Italian cultural elements. The court at Palermo attracted scholars, artists, and administrators from throughout the Mediterranean world. Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Norman French were all spoken at royal ceremonies. The kingdom's laws combined elements from multiple legal traditions. Administrative practices incorporated the most effective features of each conquered system. Roger II's administrative innovations would influence governmental development throughout medieval Europe. He created a centralized bureaucracy staffed by educated professionals rather than feudal nobles. Royal officials called justiciars administered justice and collected revenues in the king's name. Written records documented all major governmental activities. This system provided more efficient and predictable governance than the feudal arrangements common elsewhere in Europe. The kingdom's cultural achievements reached extraordinary heights during Roger II's reign. The royal palace at Palermo contained magnificent mosaics that combined Byzantine techniques with Islamic and Western design elements. The Palatine Chapel showcased architectural styles from throughout the Mediterranean world. Scholars at the royal court translated Greek, Arabic, and Latin texts, while producing original works in multiple languages. Economic prosperity flourished under Norman rule. Sicily's agricultural production increased as new irrigation systems improved crop yields. The kingdom's strategic location made it a natural centre for Mediterranean trade. Norman merchants established trading relationships throughout Europe and the Middle East. The royal treasury accumulated enormous wealth from customs duties, land taxes, and tribute payments from subject territories. Frederick II, Roger II's grandson, would transform the Sicilian kingdom into medieval Europe's most advanced state. Known as the Stupa Mundi, or Wonder of the World, Frederick combined his Norman grandfather's political skills with broader intellectual interests and imperial ambitions. He was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1220 but preferred to rule from his Sicilian territories rather than Germany. Frederick's court at Palermo became the most cosmopolitan in medieval Europe. Scholars from throughout the known world gathered to study and debate under royal patronage. The emperor himself spoke 9 languages and corresponded with Muslim rulers throughout the Middle East. His intellectual curiosity extended to natural sciences, mathematics, philosophy, and literature. The court produced remarkable achievements in poetry, architecture, and scholarship. The emperor's administrative reforms created what historians consider medieval Europe's first modern state. Professional bureaucrats replaced feudal nobles in most governmental positions. Laws were codified in clear systematic compilations. The University of Naples, founded by Frederick in 1224, trained administrators for royal service. This governmental system provided models that later influenced the development of modern European states. Frederick's conflicts with the papacy ultimately doomed his revolutionary achievements. Pope Innocent IV declared the emperor deposed in 1245 and encouraged rebellions throughout the kingdom. Frederick's death in 1250 left his successors facing impossible military and political challenges. The Papal-Angevin alliance that destroyed the Hohenstaufen dynasty represented one of medieval Europe's greatest tragedies. The Norman legacy in southern Italy extended far beyond political achievements. Their cultural synthesis created artistic and intellectual traditions that would influence European development for centuries. Legal innovations pioneered in the Norman kingdom provided models for later governmental development. The tolerance and administrative sophistication of Norman rule demonstrated possibilities for medieval political organization that would not be equaled until the Renaissance. The investiture controversy, 75-22, the revival of papal prestige during the 11th century created inevitable conflicts with imperial authority over church appointments. For centuries, emperors and kings had treated bishops and abbots as royal officials who owed their positions to secular rather than spiritual authority. This system, known as lay investiture, provided rulers with loyal administrators while generating substantial revenues through the sale of church offices. The reform movement that emerged from Cluny and other monastic centres challenged these practices as corrupt violations of canon law. Pope Gregory VII, elected in 1073, possessed both the vision and determination necessary to confront imperial control over church appointments. Born Hildebrand of Sovana in Tuscany, he had served previous popes as advisor and administrator for over 20 years. Gregory understood imperial politics intimately and was prepared for the conflicts that his reforms would generate. His papal bulls Dictatus Papae asserted sweeping claims for papal supremacy that challenged fundamental assumptions about medieval political authority. The confrontation began when Gregory prohibited lay investiture throughout Christendom and threatened to excommunicate rulers who continued the practice. Emperor Henry IV refused to accept these restrictions, arguing that bishops in Germany and Italy served as royal officials whose loyalty was essential for imperial governance. The emperor continued appointing prelates while ignoring papal protests. Both sides prepared for conflicts that would reshape European political development. Henry IV's personality and political situation made compromise virtually impossible. He had inherited the throne as a child and faced constant rebellions from German nobles who questioned his legitimacy. The emperor's authority depended on his ability to appoint loyal administrators throughout his territories. Accepting papal restrictions on investiture would have undermined his political survival. Henry chose confrontation despite the enormous risks involved. Gregory's excommunication of Henry IV in 1076 created a constitutional crisis that threatened imperial authority throughout Europe. The Pope declared the emperor's subjects released from their oaths of loyalty and invited them to elect a new ruler. German nobles who had been seeking opportunities to limit imperial power used the excommunication as justification for rebellion. Henry found himself facing military and political challenges throughout his territories. The emperor's submission at Canossa in January 1077 became one of medieval history's most dramatic episodes. Henry crossed the Alps in winter and appeared before the Pope as a barefoot penitent seeking forgiveness. Gregory, who had been travelling to Germany for a council to depose the emperor, found himself in an impossible position. Canon law required him to grant absolution to any sincere penitent, but doing so would undermine his German allies who were preparing to elect a new ruler. Henry's 3 days of penance in the snow at Canossa satisfied the Pope's spiritual requirements while creating a propaganda victory for imperial authority. The emperor's apparent humility demonstrated his Christian devotion, while his restoration removed justification for continued rebellion. Gregory had been outmaneuvered by an opponent who understood the political implications of religious ceremony better than the Pope himself understood them. The controversy continued despite Henry's apparent submission at Canossa. German rebels elected Rudolf of Swabia as anti-king with papal support. Civil war raged throughout the empire for several years while both sides sought military advantages. Henry's forces gradually gained the upper hand through superior resources and strategic positioning. Rudolf's death in battle in 1080 eliminated the most serious threat to imperial authority. Henry's invasion of Italy in 1081 demonstrated his determination to resolve the investiture controversy through military force rather than negotiation. Imperial armies besieged Rome while Gregory sought assistance from his Norman allies in the south. The Pope's alliance with Robert Guiscard had been designed precisely for such emergencies, but Norman assistance came at enormous cost to papal prestige and Roman prosperity. The sack of Rome by Norman forces in 1084 created lasting damage to Gregory's reputation and authority. Robert Guiscard's soldiers looted churches and houses while rescuing the Pope from imperial captivity. Romans who had initially supported Gregory against the emperor now blamed him for the city's devastation. The Pope fled to Monte Cassino and then to Salerno, where he died in exile in 1085. The investiture controversy continued under Gregory's successors, though with less dramatic confrontations than had characterized the earlier phases. Urban II, who became Pope in 1088, proved more pragmatic than Gregory while maintaining pressure for reform. The launching of the First Crusade in 1095 enhanced papal prestige, while providing opportunities for compromise with secular rulers who supported the Holy War. Emperor Henry V, who deposed his father in 1106, initially appeared more willing to negotiate with papal reformers. However, the new emperor discovered that his political survival required the same control over church appointments that had driven his father to conflict with Rome. Henry V's capture and imprisonment of Pope Paschal V in 1111 demonstrated that imperial policies had not changed despite the change in rulers. The Concordat of Worms, signed in 1122, finally resolved the investiture controversy through a complex compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but provided a framework for peaceful coexistence. Emperor Henry V renounced lay investiture with ring and staff, the spiritual symbols of episcopal authority. In return, Pope Calixtus II acknowledged the emperor's right to invest bishops with temporal authority through the granting of sceptre and royal regalia. The Concordat established different procedures for German and Italian bishoprics that reflected political realities in each region. German bishops were elected by cathedral chapters in the emperor's presence and received temporal investiture before spiritual consecration. Italian bishops received spiritual investiture first and temporal authority afterward. These arrangements recognized the emperor's stronger position in Germany while acknowledging papal authority in Italy. The investiture controversy had profound impacts on Italian political development beyond the immediate religious issues involved. Papal opposition to imperial authority encouraged the growth of communal movements in northern Italian cities. The conflict demonstrated that effective resistance to imperial power was possible when religious and political opposition combined. Italian nobles and urban populations learned lessons about political organization that would serve them well in future conflicts. The controversy also enhanced papal prestige and authority throughout Europe. Gregory VII's assertion of papal supremacy, though initially unsuccessful, established principles that future popes would develop and implement. The papacy emerged from the conflict as an independent political force capable of challenging secular rulers on equal terms. This transformation would have enormous implications for medieval European development. The rise of the communes, 1100-1200, the investiture controversy's disruption of imperial authority, created opportunities for Italian cities to develop new forms of self-government that would revolutionize European political development. Urban populations that had grown wealthy through revived trade and manufacturing began to challenge the feudal nobles who had traditionally governed their communities. The commune, a sworn association of citizens united for mutual protection and self-governance, emerged as Italy's most distinctive contribution to medieval political innovation. Milan became the first major Italian city to establish communal government around 1097. The city's merchants and craftsmen had prospered during the commercial revival of the late 11th century, but they remained subject to the authority of their archbishop and various feudal nobles who controlled surrounding territories. The citizens' oath to support each other against all enemies, regardless of social rank or family connections, created a revolutionary new basis for political organization. The development of communal institutions varied from city to city, but certain patterns emerged throughout northern and central Italy. Citizens elected consuls to serve as chief executives for limited terms, usually 1 year. These officials were chosen from among the most successful merchants and professionals rather than traditional aristocratic families. Councils representing different neighborhoods or occupational groups advised the consuls and approved major decisions affecting the entire community. Urban warfare became a constant feature of Italian life as communes struggled to control the territories surrounding their walls. Cities needed access to agricultural products and raw materials to support their growing populations and manufacturing activities. Feudal nobles who controlled rural areas often imposed restrictions on trade or demanded excessive tribute from urban merchants. The communes responded by building military forces capable of conquering and controlling their surrounding countryside. The development of communal armies marked a significant departure from feudal military organization. Instead of relying on aristocratic heavy cavalry, the communes created citizen militias that combined infantry, crossbow units, and mounted forces. These armies were disciplined and well-equipped, but their effectiveness depended on the willingness of prosperous citizens to risk their lives and property in military campaigns. Communal warfare required new forms of civic virtue and community solidarity. Economic prosperity provided the foundation for communal political development. Italian cities had become major centers of manufacturing and international trade by the early 12th century. Their textile industries produced high-quality cloth that commanded premium prices throughout Europe. Their bankers had developed sophisticated financial instruments that facilitated long-distance commerce. Urban populations grew rapidly as rural people migrated to cities seeking economic opportunities. The rise of professional guilds provided organizational structures that supported communal development. Craftsmen and merchants in each major industry formed associations that regulated production standards, controlled prices, and provided mutual assistance to members. These guilds became important political forces within communal governments. Guild membership often determined citizenship rights and voting privileges in communal assemblies. Frederick Barbarossa's Italian campaigns between 1154 and 1176 represented the most serious challenge to communal independence during the 12th century. The Holy Roman Emperor was determined to restore imperial authority over northern Italian cities that had become effectively independent during the investiture controversy. His armies possessed superior military technology and professional leadership, but they faced determined resistance from populations fighting for their political and economic survival. The emperor's siege and destruction of Milan in 1162 demonstrated imperial military superiority, while revealing the limitations of isolated communal resistance. The city had been the most powerful commune in northern Italy, but it could not withstand sustained assault by professional imperial forces. Frederick's harsh treatment of the defeated Milanese was intended to discourage resistance by other communes, but it actually strengthened their determination to oppose imperial restoration. The formation of the Lombard League in 1167 marked a turning point in the struggle between imperial and communal authority. 16 northern Italian cities swore mutual assistance against Frederick Barbarossa and any other enemies of communal independence. This alliance combined the resources of multiple communes while maintaining their individual autonomy. The League's military forces could match imperial armies in both numbers and equipment. The Battle of Legnano in 1176 proved that communal forces could defeat imperial armies under favourable conditions. Frederick's cavalry charged the Lombard League's infantry formations but was repelled by disciplined spear units supported by crossbow fire. The emperor himself was knocked from his horse and barely escaped capture. This victory demonstrated that citizens fighting for their homes and liberties could match professional soldiers in combat effectiveness. The Peace of Constance in 1183 formally recognized communal independence within the framework of imperial authority. Frederick acknowledged the city's rights to self-governance, taxation, and military organization. In return, the communes accepted the emperor's theoretical supremacy and agreed to provide limited military assistance for imperial campaigns. This agreement established a balance between central authority and local autonomy that would influence European political development for centuries. Communal culture produced remarkable achievements in architecture, literature, and learning during the 12th century. Cities competed to build the most magnificent cathedrals, town halls, and fortifications. These construction projects demonstrated civic pride while providing employment for growing urban populations. The architectural innovations developed in Italian communes would influence European building design throughout the medieval period. Educational developments accompanied political and economic changes in the communes. Cities established schools to train the clerks, notaries, and administrators required for their complex governmental systems. The University of Bologna, founded around 1088, became Europe's premier centre for legal studies. Other Italian cities established universities that attracted students from throughout Europe, while contributing to the revival of classical learning. Legal innovations emerged from the practical needs of communal governance and commercial development. Italian jurists rediscovered and adapted Roman law to contemporary conditions. They developed new legal concepts that addressed the rights of citizens, the authority of elected officials, and the regulation of commercial activities. These legal developments provided foundations for modern European jurisprudence. The success of communal government in Italy inspired similar movements throughout Europe, though few achieved comparable independence and sophistication. French and Flemish cities obtained charters that granted limited self-governance rights. German cities formed leagues to protect their commercial interests. English towns negotiated with royal authorities for greater autonomy. The Italian commune had demonstrated new possibilities for medieval political organization. Banking and commercial innovations developed by Italian communes revolutionized European economic life during the 12th century. Italian merchants pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, and joint stock companies that facilitated international trade. Their banks financed commercial ventures throughout Europe, while providing secure storage for merchants' profits. These financial innovations laid foundations for modern capitalism. By 1200, the Italian communes had established themselves as permanent features of European political life. They had successfully resisted imperial attempts at reconquest, while developing sophisticated systems of self-governance. Their economic prosperity provided models for urban development throughout Europe. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that citizens could govern themselves effectively without traditional aristocratic or royal authority. The age of the city-state had begun in earnest. Frederick II and the Italian Wars, 1220–1250, the communal independence achieved through the Lombard League would face its greatest challenge from an emperor who understood Italy better than any of his predecessors. Frederick II Hohenstaufen was born in Sicily, spoke Italian as his native language, and considered the peninsula his true home, rather than the German territories that provided his imperial title. When he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1220, the Italian communes faced an opponent who possessed both intimate knowledge of their strengths and unlimited determination to restore imperial authority. Frederick's contemporaries called him Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world, and the title reflected his extraordinary range of talents and interests. He spoke 9 languages fluently. His court attracted scholars, scientists, and artists from throughout the known world. He conducted scientific experiments, wrote poetry, and debated theology with Islamic philosophers. Yet beneath this intellectual brilliance lay a ruthless political calculator who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. The emperor's Italian ambitions extended far beyond traditional imperial claims to feudal overlordship. Frederick envisioned a unified Italian kingdom that would serve as the foundation for a restored Roman Empire stretching across the Mediterranean. This vision required the destruction of communal independence and papal temporal power. The emperor was prepared to wage decades of warfare to achieve these objectives, regardless of the cost in blood and treasure. Frederick's initial approach to the Italian problem combined diplomacy with intimidation. He negotiated separately with individual communes, offering favourable terms to cities that submitted voluntarily while threatening harsh punishment for continued resistance. Some smaller communities accepted imperial protection in exchange for limited autonomy. The major communes, however, recognized that submission would mean the end of their independence and prosperity. The emperor's siege of Milan in 1237 demonstrated both his military capabilities and his determination to crush communal resistance. Frederick had learned from his grandfather Frederick Barbarossa's earlier failures against the Lombard League. His army included the most advanced siege engines available, professional engineers who understood contemporary fortification techniques, and sufficient supplies to maintain a prolonged blockade. The city's defenders faced hopeless odds. Milan's surrender after a siege lasting several months marked the beginning of Frederick's systematic campaign against communal independence. The emperor's terms were deliberately harsh to discourage further resistance. The city's fortifications were demolished. Its leading citizens were exiled or imprisoned. Imperial officials replaced communal magistrates. Milan, once the proudest of Italian communes, had been reduced to a subject territory within the imperial system. The emperor's victory at the Battle of Cortenuova in 1237 shattered the reformed Lombard League and established Frederick as master of northern Italy. His forces captured the Milanese Carroccio, the sacred battle cart that symbolized communal independence and civic pride. This trophy was sent to Rome as proof of imperial triumph over rebellious subjects. The psychological impact of this victory exceeded its immediate military significance. Pope Gregory IX responded to Frederick's successes by declaring the emperor deposed and calling for a crusade against the Hohenstaufen dynasty. The papal bull portrayed Frederick as a heretic who threatened Christian civilization through his alliances with Muslim rulers and his persecution of the Church. This religious warfare transformed the conflict from a political dispute into a struggle for the soul of Christendom. The emperor's cultural achievements in Sicily provided a stark contrast to the warfare that dominated his northern Italian campaigns. His court at Palermo had become the most sophisticated in medieval Europe, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars collaborated on translations and original research. Frederick's own book on falconry, De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, demonstrated scientific methodology that would not become common until the Renaissance. The University of Naples, founded by Frederick in 1224, represented his commitment to learning and administrative efficiency. The institution trained lawyers, administrators, and diplomats for imperial service throughout Europe. Its curriculum combined classical learning with practical skills needed for governmental administration. The university attracted students from throughout Europe while contributing to the revival of Roman law and classical studies. Frederick's administrative innovations in Sicily created what historians consider medieval Europe's first modern bureaucratic state. Professional civil servants replaced feudal nobles in most governmental positions. Written records documented all major administrative activities. Legal procedures were standardized throughout the kingdom. This system provided more efficient and predictable governance than existed anywhere else in medieval Europe. The emperor's death at Castello Fiorentino in 1250 marked the beginning of the Hohenstaufen dynasty's collapse. Frederick had failed to establish stable succession arrangements that could preserve his achievements after his death. His legitimate sons lacked their father's exceptional abilities. The Papal-Angevin alliance that had opposed Frederick throughout his reign was prepared to exploit imperial weakness to complete the destruction of Hohenstaufen power. Conrad IV's brief reign as Emperor and King of Sicily ended with his death in 1254, leaving only the illegitimate Manfred to defend Hohenstaufen interests in southern Italy. Manfred proved a capable military commander who won several victories against papal forces, but he lacked the resources and international support necessary for long-term success. His death at the Battle of Benevento in 1266 effectively ended the Hohenstaufen dynasty's power in Italy. The failure of Frederick II's Italian ambitions had profound consequences for the peninsula's political development. The emperor's death removed the last serious threat to communal independence in northern and central Italy. The destruction of Hohenstaufen power in Sicily allowed foreign intervention that would dominate southern Italian politics for centuries. Most importantly, the papal victory established precedents for religious interference in temporal affairs that would shape European politics throughout the later Middle Ages. Guelph and Ghibelline struggles, 1250-1300, The collapse of Hohenstaufen power after Frederick II's death created a political vacuum that Italian city-states filled with factional conflicts that would dominate the peninsula for generations. The terms Guelph and Ghibelline, derived from rival German dynasties, took on distinctly Italian meanings as local conflicts merged with broader struggles between papal and imperial authority. These factional wars would transform Italian politics while producing some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated military and diplomatic innovations. The Guelphs, who supported papal authority against imperial claims, found their strongest support among merchant families and urban populations that had prospered under communal independence. Their political philosophy emphasized civic liberty, commercial freedom, and resistance to foreign domination. Guelph cities typically developed more democratic governmental institutions that included broader segments of their populations in political decision-making. Florence, Bologna, and most Tuscan communes adopted Guelph allegiances during the mid-13th century. The Ghibellines maintained loyalty to imperial authority even after the Hohenstaufen collapse, though their interpretation of imperial rights evolved to accommodate political realities. Ghibelline supporters included many feudal nobles who had lost power to communal governments, as well as cities that feared domination by larger Guelph neighbours. Their political vision emphasized hierarchy, tradition, and strong executive authority. Milan, Pisa, and many smaller Lombard cities remained Ghibelline despite changing circumstances. The factional conflict transcended simple political allegiances to become a fundamental division in Italian society. Guelph and Ghibelline families often lived in the same cities but maintained separate social networks, business relationships, and marriage patterns. Religious differences sometimes reinforced political divisions, with Guelphs supporting papal authority in spiritual matters, while Ghibellines maintained independence from clerical interference in secular affairs. Urban architecture reflected and reinforced factional divisions within Italian cities. Guelph and Ghibelline families built competing tower complexes that served both defensive and symbolic functions. These private fortifications, sometimes reaching heights of over 200 feet, demonstrated family power while providing refugees during periods of factional violence. The skylines of San Gimignano, Bologna, and other Italian cities still display the remnants of these medieval skyscrapers. The Battle of Monteperti in 1260 represented the high point of Ghibelline success in central Italy. Florentine Guelph forces, supported by papal troops and French cavalry, faced a Ghibelline alliance led by Siena and including Hohenstaufen loyalists from throughout Tuscany. The Ghibelline victory was complete and devastating. Thousands of Florentine citizens fled into exile while their city faced possible destruction by its triumphant enemies. Farinata degli Uberti's defence of Florence at the Ghibelline Council following Monteperti became legendary in Italian literature and political memory. When Allied commanders proposed destroying the defeated city completely, this Florentine Ghibelline nobleman argued passionately for his hometown's preservation. His intervention saved Florence from annihilation, while demonstrating that factional loyalty could coexist with civic patriotism. Dante would immortalize Farinata in his Divine Comedy as a noble opponent whose love of Florence transcended political differences. The Ghibelline triumph proved short-lived as papal policy shifted to support French intervention in Italian affairs. Pope Urban IV invited Charles of Anjou to conquer the Kingdom of Sicily and establish a reliable ally in southern Italy. The Angevin conquest that followed not only destroyed the last Hohenstaufen stronghold, but also provided Guelph factions throughout Italy with powerful foreign backing. The balance of factional power shifted decisively toward Guelph supremacy. Charles of Anjou's victory over Manfred at Benevento in 1266 and his execution of the young Conradin in 1268 eliminated the Hohenstaufen bloodline, while establishing French influence in southern Italy. The new Angevin kingdom provided military and financial support for Guelph factions throughout the peninsula. Italian Ghibellines found themselves increasingly isolated as their imperial patrons disappeared and their enemies gained powerful foreign allies. The return of Guelph exiles to Florence in 1266 marked the beginning of that city's transformation into medieval Europe's most dynamic commercial and cultural centre. The returning merchants and bankers brought extensive international connections that would make Florence the financial capital of the Western world. Their political victory established governmental institutions that combined democratic participation with administrative efficiency. The city that had nearly been destroyed 6 years earlier would soon dominate Italian affairs. Factional divisions within the Guelph movement itself created new opportunities for political realignment during the late 13th century. The White Guelphs, led by the Cerchi family in Florence, emphasized communal independence and resistance to papal temporal authority. The Black Guelphs, dominated by the Donati family, supported close cooperation with the papacy and Angevin France. These internal divisions would prove as destructive as the original Guelph-Ghibelline conflict. Dante Alighieri's political career and subsequent exile illustrated how factional conflicts affected individual lives and artistic creation. Born into a Guelph family, Dante served Florence in various governmental positions during the 1290s. His alignment with the White Guelph faction during the internal conflicts of 1300–1302 led to his permanent banishment when the Black Guelphs gained control of the city. This personal tragedy provided the inspiration for the Divine Comedy, while depriving Florence of one of its greatest citizens. The Sicilian Vespers uprising in 1282 demonstrated how Italian factional conflicts could have international implications. The revolt against Angevin rule in Sicily received support from Ghibelline exiles and Aragonese interventionists who saw opportunities to weaken French influence in Italy. The subsequent War of the Sicilian Vespers lasted 20 years and involved most European powers while devastating southern Italian society and economy. Military innovations developed during the factional wars would influence European warfare for centuries. Italian cities pioneered the use of crossbow units, pike formations, and early firearms in urban combat situations. Their professional armies, staffed by condottieri or mercenary commanders, demonstrated new possibilities for military organization that combined effectiveness with political reliability. These innovations would later influence military development throughout Europe. Economic warfare accompanied military conflicts as Guelph and Ghibelline cities attempted to destroy their enemies' commercial prosperity. Trade boycotts, financial blockades, and commercial espionage became standard weapons in factional struggles. The development of international banking allowed Italian cities to finance extended conflicts, while projecting their influence throughout Europe. Economic success increasingly determined military and political outcomes. The pacification efforts of various popes and emperors during the late 13th century demonstrated the international significance of Italian factional conflicts. Foreign rulers recognized that Italian political instability threatened broader European peace and prosperity. However, external intervention often intensified rather than resolved internal conflicts as competing foreign powers supported different Italian factions for their own strategic purposes. By 1300, the Guelph-Ghibelline conflicts had fundamentally transformed Italian society, while establishing patterns of political division that would persist for centuries. The struggles had strengthened communal institutions while creating sophisticated military and diplomatic systems. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that Italian cities possessed the resources and determination to resist external domination while maintaining their distinctive political cultures. The age of Italian independence was reaching its maturity. Florence, banking capital of Europe. Among all Italian city-states, none achieved greater prominence during the 13th century than Florence, whose merchants and bankers created financial networks that stretched across Europe and beyond. The city that had nearly been destroyed at Monteperti transformed itself into medieval Europe's economic powerhouse through innovations in banking, manufacturing, and international trade. Florentine gold florins became the preferred currency for major transactions from London to Constantinople, while the city's banks financed kings, popes, and merchants throughout the known world. The foundation of Florentine commercial success lay in the city's strategic location in the Arno Valley, which provided access to both Mediterranean ports and transalpine trade routes. Florentine merchants established permanent colonies in major European cities, creating networks of communication and exchange that surpassed those of any contemporary rivals. These international connections allowed Florence to dominate trade in luxury goods while developing new markets for manufactured products. The wool trade formed the backbone of Florence's early economic expansion. The city's textile manufacturers imported raw wool from England and Flanders, processed it using techniques learned from Flemish craftsmen, and exported finished cloth throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Florentine textile production combined high quality with efficient organization, allowing the city's products to command premium prices in competitive markets. The guild system that regulated Florentine economic life provided both stability and innovation in commercial development. The Arte di Lana, or Wool Guild, controlled all aspects of textile production from raw material imports to finished product exports. Guild regulations maintained quality standards while protecting member interests against unfair competition. Similar organizations governed banking, silk production, and other major industries that contributed to the city's prosperity. Banking innovations developed by Florentine merchants revolutionized European financial practices during the 13th century. The Medici, Pazzi, Bardi, and Peruzzi families created international banks with branches throughout Europe. These institutions pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, and bills of exchange that facilitated long-distance commerce. Their accounting practices provided unprecedented accuracy in tracking complex international transactions. The Medici Bank, founded by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici in 1397, became medieval Europe's most successful financial institution through careful management and strategic partnerships. The bank's branches operated semi-independently while maintaining coordination through regular correspondence and standardized procedures. Medici agents in major European cities provided local expertise while implementing policies determined by the central office in Florence. Florentine bankers financed royal governments throughout Europe, providing loans that allowed kings to wage wars, build palaces, and maintain their courts. Edward III of England borrowed enormous sums from Florentine banks to finance his campaigns during the 100 Years' War. The papal treasury relied heavily on Florentine financial services for collecting and transferring revenues from throughout Christendom. These international connections enhanced Florence's political influence while generating substantial profits. The development of sophisticated accounting practices allowed Florentine banks to manage complex international operations with remarkable efficiency. Detailed records tracked all transactions, monitored currency fluctuations, and calculated profits and losses across multiple markets. These innovations provided Florentine bankers with competitive advantages that their rivals could not match. The survival of Medici bank records provides modern historians with unprecedented insights into medieval commercial practices. Manufacturing innovations accompanied financial developments in creating Florence's economic supremacy. The city's craftsmen developed new techniques for dyeing cloth, working metals, and creating luxury goods. Florentine artisans produced some of Europe's finest jewelry, weapons, and decorative objects. Their workshops trained apprentices from throughout Italy, while developing skills that would later contribute to Renaissance artistic achievements. Political evolution in Florence reflected the city's economic transformation from feudal commune to merchant republic. The Ordinances of Justice, enacted in 1293, excluded feudal nobles from major governmental positions, while ensuring that political power remained concentrated among successful merchants and bankers. This system provided stable governance that protected commercial interests while maintaining enough flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. The Florentine constitution that emerged during the late 13th century created one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated governmental systems. The Signoria, consisting of 8 priors and a gonfaloniere, served as the city's executive authority for 2-month terms. Representatives were chosen by lot from among qualified guild members, ensuring broad participation while preventing the emergence of permanent ruling dynasties. This system balanced democratic participation with administrative efficiency. Cultural patronage flourished in Florence as successful merchants and bankers sought to demonstrate their wealth and civic virtue through artistic commissions. The construction of Santa Maria del Fiore, begun in 1296, showcased the city's prosperity while providing employment for hundreds of craftsmen. Wealthy families sponsored chapels, altarpieces, and public buildings that transformed Florence into one of Europe's most beautiful cities. Educational developments accompanied Florence's economic and political achievements. The city established schools that trained the clerks, accountants, and administrators required for complex commercial operations. Florentine universities attracted students from throughout Europe while contributing to the revival of classical learning. The city's libraries accumulated manuscripts that preserved ancient knowledge while encouraging contemporary scholarship. The Florentine literary renaissance that produced Dante Alighieri, Guido Cavalcanti, and other major poets reflected the city's cultural sophistication and international connections. These writers drew inspiration from classical sources, contemporary philosophy, and personal experience to create works that influenced European literature for centuries. Their use of vernacular Italian rather than Latin demonstrated confidence in local cultural traditions while appealing to broader audiences. International diplomatic activities enhanced Florence's influence throughout Europe during the late 13th century. The city's wealth allowed it to maintain permanent ambassadors in major European capitals. Florentine diplomats negotiated commercial agreements, mediated conflicts between other powers, and promoted their city's interests through sophisticated diplomatic techniques. These activities established Florence as a major player in European politics despite its limited territorial extent. The Florentine model of urban development influenced city-states throughout Italy and beyond. Other communes adopted Florentine innovations in banking, manufacturing, and governance, while adapting them to local conditions. The success of Florence demonstrated that commercial prosperity could provide the foundation for political independence and cultural achievement. The city's example inspired urban development throughout medieval Europe. Religious life in Florence combined traditional Catholic devotion with the practical concerns of a commercial society. The city's churches served as meeting places for business associations while providing spiritual guidance for merchants engaged in international trade. Florentine theologians developed new approaches to commercial ethics that reconciled religious teachings with economic realities. These innovations influenced Catholic teaching on commercial practices throughout Europe. Venice, the Serene Republic. While Florence dominated European banking and manufacturing, Venice pursued a different path to prosperity and power through maritime commerce and territorial expansion in the eastern Mediterranean. The Serene Republic, as Venetians proudly called their city, developed unique governmental institutions that combined stability with flexibility while creating one of medieval Europe's most enduring political systems. Venice would maintain its independence and prosperity for over 1,000 years through careful diplomacy, naval supremacy, and commercial innovation. The Venetian constitution that emerged during the 12th and 13th centuries represented a masterpiece of medieval political engineering. The Doge, elected for life from among the city's noble families, served as ceremonial head of state while actual power resided in various councils that checked and balanced each other's authority. The Great Council included all noble families, while the smaller Council of 10 handled matters requiring secrecy and swift action. This system prevented both tyranny and anarchy while ensuring effective governance. The famous process for electing the Doge demonstrated Venetian sophistication in preventing electoral corruption while maintaining democratic legitimacy. The procedure involved multiple stages of lot drawing and voting that made bribery or conspiracy virtually impossible. 30 council members were chosen by lot, reduced to 9 by lot, expanded to 40 by vote, reduced to 12 by lot, expanded to 25 by vote, reduced to 9 by lot, expanded to 45 by vote, and finally empowered to elect the Doge. This complex system ensured that chance and merit rather than wealth or family connections determined the city's leadership. Venice's expansion in the eastern Mediterranean during the 11th and 12th centuries established the commercial foundations for the city's later dominance. Venetian merchants obtained trading privileges throughout the Byzantine Empire that gave them significant advantages over competitors from other Italian cities. The Golden Bull issued by Emperor Alexius in 1082 granted Venetians freedom from customs duties throughout imperial territories in exchange for naval assistance against Norman attacks. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 marked the pinnacle of Venetian expansion and the beginning of the city's Mediterranean empire. Doge Enrico Dandolo, despite being over 90 years old and nearly blind, personally led the Venetian fleet that diverted the crusade from its intended destination in Egypt to Constantinople itself. The subsequent conquest and partition of the Byzantine Empire provided Venice with strategic islands and ports throughout the Aegean Sea. The Latin Empire established by the Fourth Crusade lasted only until 1261, but Venice retained many of its territorial acquisitions long after Byzantine rule was restored in Constantinople. Crete, acquired from the Byzantine partition, became the cornerstone of Venetian Mediterranean strategy for over 4 centuries. The island's strategic location allowed Venice to control eastern Mediterranean trade routes while providing agricultural products and military bases for further expansion. Commercial innovations developed by Venetian merchants influenced trading practices throughout medieval Europe. The colleganza, a form of business partnership that shared risks and profits between investors and travelling merchants, provided capital for trading ventures while limiting individual exposure to losses. Venetian accounting practices, shipping contracts, and insurance policies became models that other commercial centres adopted and adapted to their own circumstances. The Venetian arsenal, expanded dramatically during the 13th century, became medieval Europe's largest industrial complex and a marvel of organisational efficiency. The shipyard could construct an entire galley in a single day using assembly line techniques that would not appear elsewhere until the modern Industrial Revolution. The arsenal employed thousands of skilled craftsmen whose techniques were closely guarded state secrets that gave Venice decisive advantages in naval warfare. Venetian naval supremacy in the Mediterranean depended not only on superior shipbuilding, but also on innovative tactics and strategic thinking. Venetian galleys combined sails and oars in configurations that provided speed and maneuverability in both favourable and adverse weather conditions. The city's naval commanders developed battle formations and boarding techniques that proved superior to those of their rivals in numerous conflicts throughout the Mediterranean. The expansion of Venetian commerce into the Black Sea region during the 13th century opened new markets for European goods while providing access to luxury products from Central Asia and the Far East. Venetian merchants established permanent colonies at Trebizond, Caffa, and other strategic locations that served as intermediaries between European and Asian trade networks. These connections made Venice one of medieval Europe's primary sources of silk, spices, and precious stones. Diplomatic skills proved as important as military and commercial capabilities in maintaining Venetian independence and expansion. The Republic's ambassadors were among medieval Europe's most skilled negotiators, capable of playing competing powers against each other while advancing Venetian interests. The city maintained diplomatic relations with Christian and Muslim rulers throughout the Mediterranean, often switching alliances when circumstances required new arrangements. The Venetian monetary system, based on the silver grosso and later the gold ducat, provided stable currency that facilitated international trade throughout the Mediterranean region. Venetian coins maintained consistent weight and purity standards that made them preferred mediums of exchange in markets from Constantinople to Alexandria. The stability of Venetian currency reflected the city's commercial prosperity while enhancing its international reputation. Cultural achievements in Venice during this period combined Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European influences in unique syntheses that reflected the city's cosmopolitan commercial connections. St. Mark's Basilica, rebuilt during the 11th century, incorporated architectural elements from throughout the Mediterranean world while housing treasures acquired through trade and conquest. The building's golden mosaics and marble decorations demonstrated Venetian wealth while creating one of Europe's most distinctive religious structures. Social structure in Venice differed significantly from other Italian city-states due to the Republic's unique constitutional arrangements and commercial focus. The citizen nobility that governed the state derived their wealth and status primarily from maritime trade rather than landed property. Below them, the cittadini originated class-provided skilled administrators and professionals, while the popolani included craftsmen, sailors, and other working people essential for the city's operations. Religious life in Venice reflected the city's commercial concerns and international connections. The Basilica of St. Mark served not only as the Doge's chapel, but also as a symbol of Venetian independence from papal authority. The city's patron saint had been acquired through a daring theft from Alexandria in 828, demonstrating Venetian willingness to take whatever actions were necessary to enhance their city's prestige and spiritual protection. The Venetian printing industry, which emerged during the late 15th century, built upon the commercial and cultural foundations established during the medieval period. The city's international connections provided markets for printed books, while its traditions of craftsmanship ensured high production standards. Venetian publishers like Aldus Manutius created beautiful editions of classical and contemporary works that influenced European intellectual development. Milan and the Visconti. In the fertile plains of Lombardy, Milan emerged as northern Italy's dominant power during the 13th century through a combination of commercial prosperity, military innovation, and political pragmatism that would eventually produce one of Europe's most successful ruling dynasties. The city's strategic location at the intersection of major trade routes connecting France, Germany, and the Mediterranean made it a natural centre for commerce and communication, while its wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen provided resources for territorial expansion and cultural development. The rise of the Visconti family to power in Milan illustrated how successful merchant dynasties could transform themselves into ruling houses through careful political manoeuvring and strategic marriages. Ottone Visconti, who became Archbishop of Milan in 1262, used his religious authority to build political influence while accumulating vast personal wealth through careful management of church properties. His nephew Matteo Visconti inherited both spiritual and temporal authority, founding a dynasty that would rule Milan for nearly 2 centuries. Matteo Visconti's appointment as imperial vicar in 1294 provided legal justification for the family's transformation from ecclesiastical officials to secular rulers. The title granted by Emperor Adolf of Nassau acknowledged Milanese independence while maintaining theoretical imperial supremacy. This arrangement satisfied both local aspirations for self-governance and imperial claims to Italian authority, demonstrating the diplomatic skills that characterized Visconti rule throughout its duration. The Visconti expansion throughout Lombardy during the early 14th century demonstrated sophisticated military and administrative capabilities that surpassed those of most contemporary city-states. The family's armies combined traditional feudal cavalry with innovative infantry formations and early artillery pieces. Their conquest of Bergamo, Brescia, and numerous smaller cities created a territorial state that controlled much of northern Italy's agricultural and commercial wealth. Gian Galeazzo Visconti, who ruled from 1378 to 1402, represented the pinnacle of the family's achievements and ambitions. He transformed the Milanese state from a collection of conquered territories into an integrated political system with standardized laws, efficient administration, and unified military command. His purchase of the ducal title from Emperor Wenceslaus in 1395 elevated Milan to the same status as the great duchies of France and Germany. The Visconti court at Milan became one of Europe's most magnificent during the late 14th century, attracting artists, scholars, and diplomats from throughout the continent. The family's patronage supported major architectural projects, including the Gothic Cathedral of Milan, begun in 1386, which would become one of Europe's largest and most beautiful churches. The cathedral's construction provided employment for thousands of craftsmen while demonstrating Milanese wealth and artistic sophistication. Economic policies pursued by the Visconti rulers transformed Milan into northern Italy's manufacturing centre, while maintaining the city's traditional role in international commerce. The family encouraged immigration by skilled craftsmen, particularly in textile production and metalworking. Milanese armour and weapons became famous throughout Europe for their quality and innovative design. The city's workshops produced luxury goods that commanded premium prices in markets from London to Constantinople. Agricultural improvements in Visconti territories increased food production, while generating revenues that supported the family's military and cultural activities. The construction of irrigation canals, including the Naviglio Grande begun in 1177 but expanded under Visconti rule, transformed previously marginal lands into productive agricultural areas. These engineering projects demonstrated administrative capabilities while creating lasting benefits for the region's population. The Visconti Library, assembled over several generations, became one of Europe's most important collections of manuscripts and early printed books. The family's scholars produced original works in law, history, and natural philosophy, while preserving classical texts that might otherwise have been lost. This intellectual activity enhanced Milan's reputation, while contributing to the broader European Renaissance that was beginning to emerge during the late 14th century. Military innovations developed under Visconti patronage influenced warfare throughout Italy and beyond. The family's generals pioneered the use of professional infantry formations that could match aristocratic cavalry in battlefield effectiveness. They experimented with early firearms and artillery pieces that would revolutionize siege warfare. Most importantly, they developed systematic approaches to military organization that combined efficiency with political reliability. Diplomatic activities pursued by the Visconti rulers established Milan as a major player in European politics despite the city's limited territorial extent compared to the great monarchies of France and England. Visconti ambassadors negotiated marriage alliances with royal families throughout Europe. The family's representatives participated in major international conferences and peace negotiations. These activities enhanced Milanese prestige while protecting the state's commercial and territorial interests. The Visconti administrative system provided models for governmental organization that influenced political development throughout northern Italy. Professional bureaucrats replaced feudal nobles in most administrative positions. Written records documented all major governmental activities. Legal procedures were standardized throughout Visconti territories. This system provided more efficient and predictable governance than existed in most contemporary Italian states. Cultural achievements under Visconti patronage reflected the family's cosmopolitan outlook and international connections. The court supported poets, musicians, and artists who created works combining Italian traditions with influences from throughout Europe. The famous Visconti Hours, an illuminated manuscript created for Gian Galeazzo Visconti, demonstrated the artistic sophistication that characterized the family's cultural patronage. Religious policies pursued by the Visconti rulers balanced personal devotion with political pragmatism in ways that enhanced rather than threatened their secular authority. The family maintained good relations with the papacy while asserting independence in temporal matters. They sponsored church construction and monastic reform, while ensuring that religious institutions within their territories supported rather than challenged ducal authority. The collapse of Visconti power after Gian Galeazzo's death in 1402 illustrated both the achievements and limitations of personal rule in medieval Italy. The Duke's sudden death from plague left his young sons under the regency of their mother, creating opportunities for subject cities to rebel and neighbouring powers to intervene. The subsequent fragmentation of the Visconti state demonstrated how dependent Italian political systems remained on the personal capabilities of individual rulers. The Papal States and Rome. During the 13th century, the papacy achieved its greatest temporal power, while Rome experienced both decline and renewal in its role as Christianity's spiritual centre. The popes had successfully established sovereignty over territories stretching from the Adriatic to the Tyrrhenian Sea, creating a state that would endure until Italian unification in 1870. Yet this temporal success came at enormous costs, as the papal court became increasingly involved in secular politics, while Rome itself struggled with economic decay and political instability. Pope Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216, represented the apex of medieval papal authority in both spiritual and temporal affairs. His bull Sic et Universitatis proclaimed papal supremacy over all earthly rulers, while his diplomatic interventions influenced succession disputes throughout Europe. In Italy, Innocent's policies established effective papal control over central Italian territories while supporting communal independence against imperial restoration attempts by Frederick II. The papal administrative system that emerged during the 13th century combined ecclesiastical traditions with innovations borrowed from secular governments. Cardinals served as both spiritual advisors and territorial governors, administering papal territories while participating in church councils and diplomatic missions. This dual role created tensions between religious and political responsibilities that would plague papal administration throughout the medieval period. Papal finances during this period depended on diverse revenue sources that included both spiritual and temporal income. Peter's pence, collected from throughout Christendom, provided substantial revenues for papal operations. Territorial taxes from the papal states generated additional income, while fees for spiritual services such as indulgences created lucrative revenue streams. The papacy became one of medieval Europe's wealthiest institutions, though financial demands often exceeded available resources. The construction of major papal projects during the 13th century demonstrated both the Church's wealth and its commitment to architectural magnificence. The rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, though not completed until the Renaissance, began during this period with papal patronage supporting some of Europe's most skilled architects and craftsmen. Similar projects throughout the papal states created employment while demonstrating papal power and devotion. Rome's population declined significantly during the 13th century, as political instability and economic difficulties drove residents to seek opportunities elsewhere. The city's population may have fallen below 50,000 inhabitants, a dramatic decrease from its ancient peak of over 1 million. Abandoned districts within the city walls became agricultural areas where sheep grazed among classical ruins. The contrast between Rome's glorious past and diminished present became a common theme in contemporary literature. The Colonna and Orsini families dominated Roman politics during much of this period, pursuing family interests often at odds with papal authority. These powerful clans controlled numerous fortresses throughout central Italy, while maintaining palaces and towers within Rome itself. Their conflicts created constant instability that hindered economic development while threatening papal security. Several popes found themselves virtual prisoners of competing Roman noble factions. Economic revival in Rome during the late 13th century resulted primarily from increased pilgrimage traffic and papal administrative activities. The declaration of the first Jubilee year in 1300 by Pope Boniface VIII attracted hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to Rome, generating substantial revenues for local merchants and innkeepers. This success established precedents for later Jubilee celebrations that would become important sources of papal revenue. The Avignon papacy, beginning in 1309, marked the end of medieval papal temporal power in Italy, while paradoxically enhancing the Church's international influence. Pope Clement V's decision to establish the papal court in France removed the primary source of political authority from Rome, while allowing the papacy to escape the chaos of Italian factional conflicts. However, this Babylonian captivity undermined papal claims to universal authority while subjecting the Church to French political influence. The impact of papal absence on Rome was catastrophic for the city's economy and political stability. Without the papal court's patronage, many businesses failed and residents emigrated to more prosperous locations. The city's infrastructure deteriorated as maintenance funds disappeared. Political authority fragmented among competing noble families who pursued their own interests without effective central coordination. Rome entered its darkest period since the barbarian invasions. Cola di Rienzo's brief rule in Rome from 1347 to 1354 represented an attempt to restore the city's ancient glory through popular government and classical revival. This charismatic tribune appealed to republican traditions while promising to reunite Italy under Roman leadership. His spectacular rise and fall illustrated both the continuing appeal of Roman greatness and the practical difficulties of implementing utopian political programs in medieval circumstances. Monastic communities within the papal states provided islands of stability and cultural continuity during periods of political chaos. Major monasteries like Monte Cassino and Subiaco maintained schools, libraries, and agricultural estates that preserved learning while contributing to economic development. These institutions often served as refuges for scholars and artists fleeing political persecution elsewhere in Italy. The return of the papacy to Rome under Pope Gregory XI in 1377 began a slow process of urban renewal that would continue throughout the Renaissance period. The restoration of papal authority required extensive rebuilding of both governmental institutions and physical infrastructure. The popes of the late 14th century faced enormous challenges in re-establishing their temporal power while healing the spiritual wounds created by decades of absence and schism. Legal developments in the Papal States during the 13th century combined canon law traditions with innovations borrowed from secular legal systems. Papal courts handled both spiritual and temporal cases, creating complex jurisdictional arrangements that sometimes conflicted with local customs and imperial claims. The development of papal legal theory during this period established precedents that would influence church law for centuries. Cultural achievements in the Papal States reflected the Church's commitment to learning and artistic excellence despite political difficulties. Papal scriptoria preserved and copied manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost. Church-sponsored schools trained clergy and administrators throughout Europe. Religious art, patronized by the papacy, established artistic traditions that would culminate in the masterpieces of the Renaissance period. The transformation of the papacy from primarily spiritual to temporal authority during the 13th century represented one of medieval history's most significant developments. This evolution enhanced papal power while creating conflicts that would plague the Church for centuries. The success and ultimate failure of papal temporal authority demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of religious leadership in secular affairs during the medieval period. The Great Famine and Economic Crisis, 1315-1322, the prosperity and expansion that had characterized Italian city-states throughout the 13th century, began to falter as the new century opened with unprecedented challenges. Climate change was altering weather patterns across Europe. Temperatures dropped significantly from their medieval optimum. Rainfall increased dramatically during crucial growing seasons. The agricultural abundance that had supported urban growth and commercial expansion was giving way to scarcity and uncertainty that would reshape Italian society in fundamental ways. The first signs of crisis appeared in 1314 when unusually cold winter weather killed fruit trees and grapevines throughout northern Italy. Spring arrived late that year, delaying planting seasons and reducing crop yields. Summer rains fell so heavily that grain rotted in fields before harvest. The wine production that had sustained many rural communities failed almost completely. Farmers who had prospered for generations found themselves facing bankruptcy and starvation. The Great Famine began in earnest during 1315 when crop failures spread throughout Europe. Italy, which had relied increasingly on grain imports from Sicily and northern Europe, found external food sources severely limited. Prices for basic foodstuffs rose to levels that placed adequate nutrition beyond the reach of most urban workers. Bread riots erupted in Milan, Florence, and other major cities as desperate populations demanded action from their governments. Venice, with its extensive Mediterranean trade networks, initially managed better than inland cities during the early stages of the famine. Venetian merchants diverted ships from their usual routes to search for grain in North Africa and the Black Sea region. The city's government imposed strict rationing while organizing public kitchens that provided minimal sustenance to the poorest residents. However, even Venice could not completely escape the crisis that was engulfing all of Europe. Florence experienced particularly severe difficulties during the famine years because of its large population and dependence on imported food. The city's population may have exceeded 100,000 inhabitants by 1300, making it one of Europe's largest urban centres. When food supplies became scarce, the Florentine government faced impossible choices between maintaining public order and preserving the city's financial resources. Social tensions that had been manageable during prosperous times became explosive under the pressure of widespread hunger. The Ciompi, Florence's wool workers, suffered disproportionately during the crisis because their wages could not keep pace with rapidly rising food prices. These skilled craftsmen, who had formed the backbone of the city's textile industry, found themselves unable to afford basic necessities despite working longer hours under increasingly difficult conditions. Their growing desperation would eventually explode into revolution later in the 14th century. Agricultural innovation became essential for survival, as traditional farming methods proved inadequate to cope with changing climate conditions. Italian farmers began experimenting with new crops that could tolerate cooler temperatures and excessive moisture. They developed improved drainage systems to deal with flooded fields. Three-field agricultural systems gave way to more complex rotations that maintained soil fertility while maximizing yields from limited arable land. The crisis accelerated urbanization as rural populations fled to cities seeking employment and assistance. Italian cities swelled with refugees who competed for scarce jobs while straining municipal resources. Urban governments struggled to provide basic services to expanded populations while maintaining the infrastructure necessary for continued economic activity. Many cities expanded their walls to accommodate growing populations, creating building projects that provided some employment relief. Regional variations in famine impact reflected different economic structures and geographical advantages. Northern Italian cities with diversified economies generally coped better than those dependent primarily on agriculture or single industries. Coastal cities maintained some access to imported food through maritime trade networks. Mountain communities sometimes found their traditional isolation beneficial, as they could rely on local resources without competing in broader markets. Milan's response to the famine demonstrated the growing sophistication of urban administration in dealing with large-scale crises. The Visconti government organized systematic distribution of available food supplies while implementing public works projects that provided employment for displaced workers. The city's arsenal expanded production to maintain exports that could pay for food imports. These policies helped Milan weather the crisis while strengthening governmental authority over urban populations. Banking institutions throughout Italy faced severe challenges as loans defaulted and commercial activities declined. The great Florentine banking houses that had dominated European finance found their resources stretched beyond capacity. Some smaller banks failed completely, creating additional economic disruption. However, the crisis also spurred innovations in credit and insurance that would later contribute to economic recovery and expansion. The papal court at Avignon provided some relief to Italian territories through the distribution of stored grain and charitable assistance. However, papal resources were also strained by the crisis affecting all of Christendom. The Church's temporal authority in central Italy proved inadequate to coordinate effective famine relief across the papal states. Local communities were largely left to cope with the crisis using their own limited resources. Technological innovations emerged from the necessity of coping with changing agricultural conditions. Italian engineers developed improved mills that could operate efficiently with irregular water flows. New techniques for food preservation allowed communities to maintain reserves for future emergencies. Advances in navigation and shipbuilding helped merchants locate and transport scarce food supplies more effectively than had been possible previously. The psychological impact of the Great Famine may have been as significant as its immediate material effects. Populations that had grown accustomed to increasing prosperity and expanding opportunities suddenly faced the reality of scarcity and decline. Traditional religious explanations for natural disasters competed with growing awareness that human actions could influence outcomes. The crisis challenged fundamental assumptions about progress and divine favor that had characterized the medieval worldview. Social structures adapted to cope with prolonged crisis as extended families and neighborhood communities developed new systems of mutual support. Traditional charity expanded to include more systematic approaches to poor relief. Guild organizations took on increased responsibilities for maintaining their members during economic difficulties. These adaptations strengthened some community bonds while creating new tensions between competing groups. The famine's end around 1322 did not immediately restore prosperity to Italian society. Agricultural production recovered slowly as farmers rebuilt their livestock herds and restored damaged infrastructure. Urban populations remained larger than before the crisis, creating permanent changes in social and economic structures. The experience had demonstrated both the vulnerability of medieval civilization and the capacity of Italian communities to adapt and survive under extreme circumstances. Long-term consequences of the Great Famine would become apparent throughout the 14th century as Italian society struggled with the demographic economic and social changes that the crisis had produced. The famine had revealed weaknesses in traditional systems while encouraging innovations that would eventually contribute to recovery and renewal. Most importantly, it had prepared Italian communities for the even greater challenge that would arrive with the Black Death just 25 years later. The Black Death and its aftermath, 1347-1400, the merchant ships that arrived at Messina in October 1347 brought more than silk and spices from the east. Hidden among their cargo holds and crew quarters was a pestilence that would transform European civilization more dramatically than any war or political upheaval. The plague, which contemporaries called the Great Mortality, and later generations would name the Black Death, spread with terrifying speed through Italy's interconnected trade networks. Within 3 years, it would kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of the peninsula's population. The disease arrived in Italy through the very commercial networks that had brought prosperity to the maritime republics. Genoese galleys returning from Caffa in the Crimea carried infected rats and fleas that would serve as vectors for the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis. The plague manifested in multiple forms, bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, each presenting different symptoms but all capable of killing victims within days of infection. Few who contracted the disease survived. Sicily experienced the plague's initial assault with devastating results. The island's population, which may have approached 600,000 before 1347, fell by at least half within 2 years. Entire villages were abandoned as their inhabitants died or fled. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers perished in their fields. The sophisticated administrative system that had governed Norman and later Hohenstaufen Sicily disintegrated as officials died faster than they could be replaced. The plague spread northward along Italy's established trade routes with mathematical precision. Florence recorded its first cases in April 1348. Venice reported deaths beginning in May of the same year. Milan, protected initially by Alpine barriers, succumbed during the summer months. No city, regardless of wealth or defensive preparations, could halt the pestilence's advance. The interconnectedness that had created Italian prosperity now facilitated the spread of death. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague in Florence, provides the most vivid contemporary account of the disease's impact on urban society. Boccaccio described corpses piled in the streets, families abandoning infected relatives, and the complete breakdown of social order as normal human relationships dissolved under the pressure of universal mortality. His fictional frame narrative of young aristocrats fleeing the city reflected the real behavior of those wealthy enough to seek refuge in the countryside. The plague's demographic impact varied significantly across different Italian regions and social groups. Dense urban populations suffered higher mortality rates than rural areas. The poor, living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, died in greater numbers than the wealthy, who could flee to isolated country estates. Clergy, who maintained contact with the dying through religious duties, experienced mortality rates that may have exceeded 50% in many locations. Economic disruption followed immediately upon demographic collapse, as entire industries lost their workforces while demand for their products disappeared. The great textile manufactories of Florence and Milan fell silent as both workers and customers died. International trade declined precipitously as merchant families were destroyed and commercial relationships severed. Agricultural production plummeted not only from peasant deaths, but also from the abandonment of marginal lands that required intensive cultivation. Labour shortages created by massive mortality transformed social and economic relationships throughout Italy. Surviving workers found themselves in unprecedented positions of bargaining power as employers competed for scarce labour. Wages rose dramatically in most industries while working conditions improved. Peasants abandoned serfdom in large numbers, moving to locations that offered better terms or migrating to cities where opportunities existed for social advancement. The Catholic Church faced crises as profound as any in its history. Parish priests died in enormous numbers while performing their sacramental duties. Monastic communities living in close quarters suffered almost complete extinction in many locations. the church hierarchy struggled to maintain basic religious services while dealing with theological challenges posed by the apparent arbitrariness of divine judgment. Some interpreted the plague as punishment for human sinfulness, while others questioned traditional explanations for suffering. Venice demonstrated remarkable resilience during the plague years through governmental policies that combined practical public health measures with maintenance of commercial activities. The city imposed quarantine regulations that may have reduced transmission rates. Venetian merchants, though suffering heavy losses, maintained some trade relationships that facilitated recovery. The Republic's unique geographic situation provided some protection against the social upheavals that devastated other Italian communities. Florence experienced not only demographic catastrophe, but also social revolution during the plague's aftermath. The Ciompi Rebellion of 1378 reflected the breakdown of traditional hierarchies as surviving workers demanded political participation commensurate with their economic importance. The revolt succeeded temporarily in establishing a more democratic government before being suppressed by conservative forces. However, the social changes initiated during the plague years proved irreversible in the long term. Our responses to the plague varied dramatically across Italian society. Some communities embraced extreme penitential practices, believing that divine anger could be appeased through self-punishment. Flagellant movements gained temporary popularity in some regions. Others turned to practical measures such as improved sanitation and medical care. A few intellectuals began questioning traditional religious explanations for natural phenomena, contributing to intellectual changes that would characterize the Renaissance. Artistic and cultural responses to the plague reflected both despair and renewed appreciation for life. The theme of death became prominent in Italian art, with frescoes and paintings depicting the universality of mortality across all social classes. However, the crisis also inspired celebrations of human achievement and earthly beauty. Artists began emphasizing individual personality and emotional expression rather than purely religious themes. Regional variations in plague impact and recovery patterns reflected different economic structures, governmental capabilities, and geographic factors. Northern Italian cities with diversified economies generally recovered more quickly than those dependent on single industries. Areas with effective governmental institutions maintained better order during the crisis. Coastal regions benefited from continued access to international trade networks, while isolated mountain communities sometimes escaped the worst effects entirely. The plague's impact on women varied significantly depending on social class and regional circumstances. Some women inherited property and businesses from deceased male relatives, gaining unprecedented economic independence. Others found themselves vulnerable to exploitation without traditional family protections. The crisis disrupted marriage patterns while creating opportunities for some women to enter occupations previously restricted to men. Medical understanding and practice evolved in response to the plague's challenge, though slowly and often ineffectively. Italian physicians began systematic observations of disease symptoms and transmission patterns. New hospitals were established while existing ones expanded their capacities. However, medical knowledge remained inadequate to cope with epidemic disease, and many practitioners died while treating patients. Agricultural reorganization followed demographic collapse as survivors consolidated holdings and abandoned marginal lands. The manorial system that had characterized medieval agriculture largely disappeared in many regions. Sharecropping arrangements became more common as landowners competed for scarce agricultural workers. These changes contributed to gradual improvements in peasant living standards during the later 14th century. Urban planning innovations emerged from the necessity of dealing with massive mortality and social disruption. Cities expanded their burial grounds and developed new systems for disposing of corpses. Public health regulations addressed sanitation concerns that had been ignored during periods of population growth. Some communities rebuilt with wider streets and better ventilation after plague-related fires or deliberate reconstruction. The psychological and cultural trauma of the plague would influence Italian society for generations. The experience of universal mortality created new attitudes toward death, family relationships, and social responsibility. Traditional authorities, both secular and religious, had proven inadequate to cope with the crisis, encouraging experimentation with new forms of organization and belief. The stage was set for the cultural and intellectual innovations that would characterize the Italian Renaissance. Political evolution and new forms of government. The demographic and economic upheavals caused by famine and plague accelerated political changes that had been developing gradually throughout the 13th century. The traditional commune system, based on shared governance among merchant and artisan classes, proved inadequate to cope with the crises that emerged during the 14th century. Across northern and central Italy, cities began adopting new forms of government that concentrated authority in the hands of individual rulers or small oligarchies, capable of making rapid decisions and implementing effective policies. The transformation from commune to signoria represented one of medieval Europe's most significant political developments. The signore, or lord, typically emerged from among the city's most powerful families through a combination of wealth, military capability, and popular support. Unlike traditional feudal nobles who derived authority from land ownership and hereditary status, the signori built their power on urban resources and commercial relationships. They ruled as princes but maintained the forms and often the substance of republican institutions. The rise of professional military commanders called condottieri fundamentally altered Italian warfare and politics during the 14th century. These mercenary captains commanded disciplined armies of professional soldiers who fought for wages rather than feudal obligations or civic duty. The condottieri offered their services to the highest bidder while developing sophisticated military technologies and tactics. Some successful commanders parlayed their military reputation into political authority, establishing dynasties that would rule Italian states for centuries. Francesco Sforza's career illustrated how military success could lead to political power in 14th century Italy. Born the illegitimate son of a condottiero, Sforza built his reputation through successful campaigns for various employers, including the Pope and the Duke of Milan. His marriage to Bianca Maria Visconti provided him with claims to Milanese territory that he enforced through military action. When he seized control of Milan in 1450, Sforza transformed himself from hired soldier to legitimate prince through a combination of force and diplomatic recognition. The development of Renaissance diplomacy during the 14th century reflected Italian political sophistication and the need for complex international relationships. Italian rulers pioneered the use of resident ambassadors who maintained permanent missions at foreign courts. These diplomats gathered intelligence, negotiated treaties, and represented their rulers' interests in an increasingly complex international system. The diplomatic innovations developed in the Italian city-states would eventually influence governmental practices throughout Europe. The balance of power principle that emerged during this period represented a sophisticated approach to international relations that sought to prevent any single power from dominating the Italian peninsula. Cities formed shifting alliances designed to check the ambitions of their strongest neighbours while maintaining their own independence. This system required constant diplomatic activity and occasional warfare, but succeeded in preserving the political diversity that characterized Italian civilization. Legal developments during the 14th century reflected the need for governmental systems that could cope with rapid social and economic changes. Italian jurists developed new approaches to commercial law that addressed banking, insurance, and international trade relationships. They adapted Roman law principles to contemporary circumstances while creating entirely new legal concepts. The legal innovations pioneered in Italian city-states would influence European jurisprudence for centuries. Administrative innovations accompanied political changes as new forms of government required more sophisticated bureaucratic systems. Professional civil servants replaced amateur magistrates in many governmental positions. Written records became essential for tracking complex administrative activities. Standardized procedures were developed for taxation, judicial proceedings, and public works projects. These administrative developments provided models for modern European governmental systems. The role of popular councils evolved significantly during the 14th century as political authority became increasingly concentrated in individual rulers or small oligarchies. Some cities maintained the forms of communal government while transferring real power to signori who ruled behind republican facades. Others abolished popular participation entirely, creating frankly autocratic systems. The most successful rulers balanced efficiency with legitimacy by maintaining some popular involvement in governmental processes. Urban planning and public works projects became increasingly important as rulers sought to demonstrate their authority while addressing practical needs of growing cities. The construction of palaces, fortifications, and public buildings provided employment while creating monuments to governmental power. Street improvements, water systems, and market facilities enhanced urban life while generating revenues through increased commercial activity. The emergence of court culture during the late 14th century reflected the transformation of Italian city-states from republican communes to princely territories. Rulers surrounded themselves with scholars, artists, and courtiers who enhanced their prestige while providing practical services. Court ceremonies became elaborate demonstrations of political authority that impressed both subjects and foreign visitors. The cultural patronage associated with court life would contribute significantly to Renaissance artistic achievements. Taxation systems evolved to meet the financial demands of professional military forces and expanded governmental activities. Italian cities developed sophisticated methods for assessing and collecting taxes that maximized revenues while minimizing resistance. New forms of indirect taxation generated income without creating excessive burdens on commercial activities. The fiscal innovations pioneered during this period provided models for modern European tax systems. The relationship between secular and religious authority became increasingly complex as temporal rulers asserted greater control over church institutions within their territories. Some signori appointed bishops and abbots while controlling church revenues for governmental purposes. Others maintained cordial relationships with religious authorities while ensuring that church activities supported rather than challenged their political objectives. These arrangements foreshadowed the religious settlements that would emerge during the Renaissance. Women's political roles evolved during the 14th century as demographic changes and new governmental systems created opportunities for female participation in public affairs. Some women inherited political authority from deceased husbands or fathers, ruling as regents or independent sovereigns. Others exercised influence through marriage alliances or cultural patronage. While female political participation remained limited, it increased significantly compared to earlier medieval periods. The development of written constitutions and legal codes reflected the growing sophistication of Italian political thought during the 14th century. Rulers sought to legitimize their authority through carefully crafted documents that defined governmental powers and citizen rights. These constitutional innovations provided stability while establishing precedents for limited government that would influence later political development throughout Europe. Cultural Renaissance beginnings. The crisis of the 14th century paradoxically stimulated cultural creativity that would fundamentally transform European civilization. As traditional authorities struggled with unprecedented challenges, Italian intellectuals and artists began developing new approaches to learning, literature, and artistic expression. The work of Dante Alighieri, Francesco Petrarch, and Giotto di Bondone established foundations for the cultural movement that would become known as the Renaissance, demonstrating that periods of crisis could generate remarkable cultural achievements. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, completed shortly before his death in 1321, represented the culmination of medieval culture while pointing toward new literary possibilities. Written in vernacular Italian rather than scholarly Latin, the epic poem demonstrated that contemporary language could achieve the dignity and complexity previously associated only with classical literature. Dante's synthesis of Christian theology, classical philosophy, and personal experience created a work that appealed to both learned and popular audiences. The Divine Comedy's political dimensions reflected Dante's involvement in Florentine affairs and his subsequent exile from his beloved city. The poem's vision of hell, purgatory, and paradise served as vehicles for commentary on contemporary political and religious issues. Dante's condemnation of corrupt church officials and secular rulers while praising virtuous pagans from classical antiquity demonstrated intellectual independence that would characterize Renaissance humanism. The linguistic achievement of the Divine Comedy established Tuscan dialect as the foundation for modern Italian literary language. Dante's conscious choice to write in the vernacular rather than Latin made his work accessible to readers throughout the Italian peninsula, while demonstrating the expressive capabilities of contemporary speech. This literary precedent encouraged other writers to employ vernacular languages, contributing to the development of national literatures throughout Europe. Francesco Petrarch, often considered the first humanist, developed new approaches to classical learning that emphasized individual experience and emotional expression rather than systematic theological analysis. His letters to ancient authors like Cicero demonstrated psychological identification with classical figures, while his poetry explored personal themes with unprecedented sophistication. Petrarch's scholarly methods, including critical analysis of classical texts, established foundations for modern historical and literary studies. Petrarch's collection of sonnets addressed to Laura created new standards for vernacular poetry, while exploring themes of love, loss, and spiritual aspiration with remarkable psychological depth. These poems combined classical literary techniques with medieval courtly traditions to create works that influenced European poetry for centuries. The Petrarchan sonnet form became a standard vehicle for poetic expression throughout Europe during the Renaissance period. The humanist movement that Petrarch initiated emphasized the dignity and potential of human beings while maintaining Christian religious commitments. Humanists studied classical texts not merely for their historical interest, but as sources of wisdom relevant to contemporary life. They developed new educational programs that combined classical learning with practical skills needed for civic and professional life. These pedagogical innovations would transform European educational practices during the Renaissance. Giotto di Bondone revolutionized European painting through innovations that emphasized naturalistic representation, emotional expression, and narrative clarity. His frescoes in the Arena Chapel at Padua, completed around 1305, demonstrated new approaches to spatial representation and human characterization that departed dramatically from earlier medieval artistic traditions. Giotto's work established foundations for the artistic developments that would characterize Renaissance painting. The artistic innovations pioneered by Giotto reflected broader cultural changes that emphasized direct observation of nature and human behavior rather than reliance on traditional symbolic systems. His paintings portrayed biblical scenes with psychological realism that made religious stories more immediate and emotionally compelling for contemporary viewers. These artistic developments paralleled intellectual movements that emphasized experience and reason alongside traditional religious authority. University development during the 14th century provided institutional foundations for the cultural changes that were beginning to emerge throughout Italian society. The University of Bologna continued to dominate European legal studies while expanding into other fields. New institutions were established at Florence, Pisa, and other Italian cities. These universities attracted students from throughout Europe while contributing to the revival of classical learning that would characterize the Renaissance. The development of vernacular literature in various Italian dialects during the 14th century reflected growing cultural confidence and regional identity. Writers throughout the peninsula produced works in their local languages while maintaining awareness of broader Italian literary traditions established by Dante and Petrarch. This literary diversity contributed to the cultural richness that would make Italy the center of European intellectual life during the Renaissance. Scientific and philosophical developments during the 14th century challenged traditional authorities while establishing new methods for investigating natural phenomena. Italian scholars began systematic observations of biological and physical processes while developing mathematical techniques for analyzing their results. These intellectual innovations provided foundations for the scientific revolution that would transform European thought during the Renaissance and early modern periods. The patronage system that supported cultural development during the 14th century reflected the growing wealth and sophistication of Italian urban society. Successful merchants, professional men, and governmental officials commissioned works of art and literature while supporting scholars and artists. This patronage created opportunities for cultural creativity, while ensuring that intellectual and artistic achievements reflected the values and interests of their sponsors. Library development during this period preserved classical texts while making them available to contemporary scholars. Private collectors assembled manuscripts that contained works by ancient authors previously unknown in Western Europe. Monastic libraries continued their traditional role in preserving learning while adapting to new scholarly interests. These collections provided the textual foundations for the classical revival that would characterize Renaissance humanism. The emergence of historical consciousness during the 14th century represented a fundamental shift in European intellectual life. Italian scholars began viewing their own era as distinct from both classical antiquity and the medieval period that preceded them. This historical awareness contributed to the sense of cultural renewal that would inspire Renaissance intellectual and artistic achievements, while encouraging systematic study of the past as a source of wisdom for contemporary life. The Great Western Schism, 1378-1470, the return of the papacy to Rome in 1377 under Gregory VII, should have restored stability to the Church and enhanced papal authority throughout Christendom. Instead, it precipitated the most serious crisis in papal history, as competing claims to legitimate authority divided the Church for nearly 40 years. The Great Western Schism, as this period became known, profoundly affected Italian politics while raising fundamental questions about religious authority that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. The election of Urban VI in 1378 began the schism through the new pope's harsh treatment of the cardinals who had selected him. Urban's attempts to reform the papal court through severe disciplinary measures alienated the very officials whose support he needed to govern effectively. His abrasive personality and controversial policies convinced most cardinals that they had made a terrible mistake in choosing him as pope. Within months of his election, they were planning his replacement. The cardinals' declaration that Urban's election had been invalid due to pressure from the Roman mob provided the legal justification for selecting a new pope. Their choice of Clement VII, who established his court at Avignon, created two papal lines that would persist for decades. Each pope commanded genuine religious devotion and political support, making resolution of the conflict extremely difficult. Christendom found itself divided between competing claims to spiritual authority. Italian politics became hopelessly entangled with the papal schism as different city-states and ruling families supported different papal lines. The Kingdom of Naples, under French influence, recognized the Avignon Pope while most northern Italian cities acknowledged Roman authority. Venice and Florence, despite their usual political rivalry, found themselves on the same side of the papal dispute while Milan and Genoa supported opposing candidates. These religious divisions intensified existing political conflicts. The impact on church administration was devastating as parallel hierarchies competed for the loyalty of clergy and laity throughout Europe. Bishops found themselves forced to choose between competing papal authorities, while knowing that any choice might later be deemed invalid. Monastic communities split into factions supporting different papal lines. The collection of papal revenues became increasingly difficult as local authorities questioned the legitimacy of competing claims to taxation rights. University communities played crucial roles in developing solutions to the schism crisis through scholarly analysis of legal and theological issues involved in determining legitimate papal authority. Canon lawyers at the University of Paris developed conciliar theory that argued church councils could possess authority superior to individual popes under certain circumstances. Italian universities contributed to these debates while training legal scholars who would participate in resolving the crisis. The Council of Pisa in 1409 attempted to resolve the schism by deposing both existing papal lines and electing a new pope who would command universal recognition. However, neither the Roman nor Avignon popes accepted the council's authority to depose them, creating a three-way division that made the crisis even more complex. The Pisan pope commanded significant support but could not eliminate his rivals, leaving Christendom with three competing claims to papal authority. Economic consequences of the schism affected Italian society through disrupted trade relationships, uncertain legal jurisdictions, and reduced papal patronage for cultural and charitable activities. merchants found themselves dealing with multiple church authorities who might impose conflicting regulations or taxation demands. The great banking houses that had prospered through papal financial services faced uncertainty about which debts would be honoured by eventual settlement of the dispute. The Council of Constance, which met from 1414 to 1418, finally resolved the schism through a combination of diplomatic negotiation and canonical legislation. The council successfully convinced or compelled all three papal lines to resign their claims while electing Martin Feuve as the universally recognized pope. The settlement established precedents for conciliar authority that would influence church governance for centuries while restoring unity to Western Christendom. Popular religious movements during the Schism period reflected lay concerns about spiritual authority and authentic religious practice. Some communities embraced mystical traditions that emphasized direct personal relationship with God rather than institutional mediation. Others supported reform movements that demanded higher standards of clerical behavior and church administration. These religious developments contributed to the spiritual renewal that would characterize the late medieval and Renaissance periods. The resolution of the schism enhanced papal authority in some respects while establishing permanent limitations on papal power in others. Subsequent popes successfully reasserted control over church administration and eliminated most conciliar challenges to their authority. However, the crisis had demonstrated that papal claims to absolute spiritual authority could be successfully challenged under certain circumstances. The precedent would influence later conflicts between church and secular authorities. Italian cultural development during the Schism period reflected the intellectual ferment created by fundamental questions about authority and legitimacy. Scholars, artists, and writers explored themes of governance, justice, and spiritual authenticity with new sophistication. The crisis stimulated philosophical and theological reflection that contributed to the intellectual foundations of Renaissance humanism, while encouraging individual thought and expression. The administrative reforms implemented by Martin V and his successors to prevent future schisms enhanced the efficiency and effectiveness of papal government. New procedures for papal elections reduced the likelihood of disputed outcomes. Improved financial administration increased papal revenues while reducing opportunities for corruption. These reforms provided foundations for the papal monarchy that would characterize the Renaissance period. Women's religious experiences during the schism reflected both the opportunities and limitations created by competing claims to spiritual authority. Some female religious communities gained greater independence as competing papal lines sought their support through favorable privileges. Others found themselves divided by loyalty conflicts that disrupted community life. The long-term consequences of the Great Western Schism extended far beyond the immediate resolution of competing papal claims. The crisis had demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional religious authorities while encouraging new forms of spiritual expression and intellectual inquiry. The experience of institutional failure and recovery provided lessons that would influence European development during the Renaissance and Reformation periods. Most importantly for Italian history, the schism had shown that even the most fundamental authorities could be successfully challenged and reformed when circumstances demanded change. The Italian Wars begin, 1498 or 1500, the delicate balance of power that had preserved Italian independence throughout the 15th century shattered in 1494 when King Charles V of France crossed the Alps with the largest army Europe had seen since Roman times. The French invasion marked the beginning of a new era in Italian history, as the peninsula became the battleground for competing European powers whose military capabilities far exceeded those of even the strongest Italian city-states. The political fragmentation that had once been Italy's strength now became a fatal weakness in an age of emerging national monarchies. Charles VIII's invasion was precipitated by his claim to the Kingdom of Naples through Angevin inheritance rights that dated back to the 13th century. The French king possessed resources that dwarfed those available to any Italian ruler. His treasury could support armies of unprecedented size for extended campaigns. His artillery train included bronze cannons that could breach medieval fortifications with devastating effectiveness. Most importantly, his kingdom provided a unified command structure that could coordinate military operations across vast territories. The immediate cause of French intervention was the appeal for assistance made by Ludovico Sforza of Milan, who feared that the new King of Naples might support rival claims to Milanese territory. Ludovico's invitation to foreign intervention demonstrated the short-sighted opportunism that would prove catastrophic for Italian independence. He believed he could control French involvement while using their military power to eliminate his enemies. This calculation would prove disastrously wrong. The speed of French success shocked Italian observers who had grown accustomed to prolonged campaigns between relatively equal opponents. Charles V's army swept through northern Italy, capturing fortress after fortress with artillery bombardments that lasted hours rather than the months typically required for medieval sieges. The Italians discovered that their military technology and tactics, which had seemed advanced by European standards, were obsolete compared to the innovations developed by the emerging national monarchies. Florence initially attempted to resist the French advance through diplomatic negotiation and defensive preparations. The Republic's government commissioned additional fortifications while seeking alliances with other Italian powers. However, the speed of French military success made effective resistance impossible. Florence was forced to open its gates to Charles VIII, who demanded enormous tribute payments and the restoration of the Medici family, which had been expelled from the city 2 years earlier. The French occupation of Rome in December 1494 demonstrated the helplessness of traditional Italian authorities in the face of modern military power. Pope Alexander VI fled the city as French troops approached, while Roman nobles scrambled to negotiate terms that might preserve their properties and privileges. The sight of foreign soldiers camping in the Forum and using classical monuments for target practice symbolized the end of Italian political independence. Naples fell to the French invaders in February 1495 with minimal resistance, completing Charles VIII's conquest of the peninsula in less than a year. The Aragonese dynasty that had ruled southern Italy for over a century collapsed as its supporters either fled the kingdom or submitted to French authority. The speed and completeness of this collapse revealed how dependent Italian political systems had become on personal relationships rather than institutional foundations. The formation of the League of Venice in March 1495 represented a belated attempt by Italian powers to expel the French invaders through coordinated military action. The League included Venice, Milan, the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain, demonstrating the international dimensions that Italian conflicts had acquired. However, this alliance reflected desperation rather than strength, as Italian powers found themselves dependent on foreign assistance to regain control of their own territories. The Battle of Fornovo in July 1495 marked the first effective Italian resistance to French military dominance, though the results were ambiguous. Charles VIII succeeded in fighting his way back to France with most of his army intact, but he was forced to abandon his Italian conquests and most of his artillery. Italian forces demonstrated that they could compete with foreign armies under favourable circumstances, but they lacked the resources for sustained campaigns against major European powers. The introduction of new military technologies during the French invasion transformed Italian warfare permanently. Artillery became the dominant factor in siege operations, rendering many existing fortifications obsolete. Infantry armed with pikes and firearms proved superior to traditional heavy cavalry under most battlefield conditions. These technological changes required enormous investments in new weapons, fortifications, and training that strained the resources of even the wealthiest Italian states. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied military changes fundamentally altered Italian international relations. The balance of power system that had preserved Italian independence through shifting alliances between roughly equal opponents gave way to client relationships with major European powers. Italian rulers found themselves forced to choose between French and Spanish protection, losing the independence that had characterized their diplomatic traditions. Economic disruption followed military conquest as foreign armies disrupted trade networks and imposed tribute payments that drained Italian resources. The great banking houses of Florence and other Italian cities found their international operations threatened by political instability and military destruction. Manufacturing declined as warfare interrupted production, while markets disappeared under the pressure of foreign occupation and tribute demands. The psychological impact of foreign conquest may have been as significant as its immediate political and economic consequences. Italians who had viewed their civilization as superior to that of northern European barbarians suddenly found themselves subjects of foreign rulers whose military capabilities they could not match. This humiliation stimulated both defensive nationalism and admiring imitation of foreign institutions and practices. Cultural responses to the French invasion varied dramatically across Italian society. Some intellectuals embraced the cosmopolitan possibilities created by increased foreign contact, while others mourned the loss of Italian independence and cultural distinctiveness. Artists and writers found new patrons among foreign occupiers, while struggling to maintain connections to traditional Italian cultural values and practices. The return of the Medici to Florence in 1494 under French protection demonstrated how foreign intervention could overturn domestic political arrangements that had previously seemed stable. The Republican government that had expelled the Medici found itself powerless to resist their restoration when it was supported by overwhelming foreign military force. This precedent would encourage other exiled Italian rulers to seek foreign assistance in regaining their territories. Spanish intervention in southern Italy beginning in 1495 created a two-front war that would continue intermittently for decades. The Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, possessed resources comparable to those of France and were determined to prevent French domination of the Mediterranean. Their involvement transformed Italian conflicts from localized disputes into components of broader European power struggles that Italian rulers could influence but not control. The period from 1494 to 1500 established patterns that would dominate Italian politics for centuries. Foreign powers would compete for control of Italian territories, while Italian rulers survived by choosing the winning side in broader European conflicts. The political fragmentation that had once enabled Italian independence now facilitated foreign domination, as competing city-states could be played against each other by external powers. The age of Italian political autonomy was ending, though its cultural achievements would continue to influence European development for generations. Florence under the Medici. The rise of the Medici family from humble money changers to Europe's most powerful bankers, and eventually to hereditary rulers of Florence, represents one of the most remarkable success stories in medieval history. Their ascent paralleled Florence's transformation from a factional commune into the Renaissance world's cultural capital, demonstrating how commercial success, political skill, and cultural patronage could combine to create lasting influence that extended far beyond the boundaries of a single city-state. Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici established the foundation of Medici power during the early 15th century through careful banking practices that emphasized reliability over spectacular profits. His bank, founded in 1397, grew steadily by providing secure financial services to merchants, churchmen, and rulers throughout Europe. Giovanni's conservative management policies created the capital reserves that would allow his descendants to dominate European finance while pursuing ambitious political and cultural projects. Cosimo de' Medici, known as the Elder, transformed his father's successful business into the instrument of Florentine political dominance after his return from exile in 1434. His enemies had temporarily expelled him from Florence on charges of corruption and tyranny, but Cosimo's financial connections proved more powerful than his opponent's political maneuvers. When he returned to Florence with foreign support, his first actions demonstrated the ruthless effectiveness that would characterize Medici rule for generations. The Medici banking network at its zenith during Cosimo's lifetime included branches in Rome, Venice, Milan, Naples, Avignon, Bruges, and London, creating the first truly international financial institution since the collapse of the Roman Empire. Each branch operated with considerable independence while coordinating policies with the central office in Florence. This decentralized structure provided flexibility while maintaining the unified direction that gave the Medici decisive advantages over their competitors. Cosimo's political control of Florence was exercised through informal influence rather than official positions, earning him the title Pater Patriae, or Father of the Country. He manipulated electoral procedures to ensure that his supporters held key governmental positions while maintaining the outward forms of republican government. This indirect rule proved more effective than open tyranny because it avoided the violent resistance that had destroyed other Italian strongmen while preserving the civic traditions that Florentines valued. The cultural patronage that began under Cosimo de' Medici established Florence as the centre of Renaissance humanism while creating artistic treasures that still attract visitors from throughout the world. Cosimo commissioned Donatello's Bronze David, the first freestanding nude sculpture since classical antiquity, while supporting scholars who collected and translated Greek manuscripts that preserved ancient wisdom. His palace, designed by Michelozzo, became a model for Renaissance residential architecture. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, brought Medici cultural patronage to unprecedented heights during his rule from 1469 to 1492. His court attracted the most talented artists, scholars, and writers of his generation, creating an environment that fostered intellectual and artistic innovation. Michelangelo lived in the Medici Palace as a young man, receiving artistic training while absorbing the humanist culture that would influence his later masterpieces. The Platonic Academy established by Lorenzo de' Medici became Renaissance Europe's most important centre for philosophical study and discussion. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola developed new approaches to classical learning that emphasized the dignity and potential of human beings while maintaining Christian religious commitments. Their work influenced European intellectual development for centuries, while establishing Florence's reputation as the Renaissance world's cultural capital. Lorenzo's political skills enabled him to survive the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, which represented the most serious threat to Medici dominance during the 15th century. The plot, supported by Pope Sixtus IV and members of the rival Pazzi banking family, resulted in the assassination of Lorenzo's brother Giuliano during Easter services in the cathedral. Lorenzo's escape and the violent popular reaction against the conspirators demonstrated both his personal courage and the extent of popular support for Medici rule. The diplomatic revolution that followed the Pazzi conspiracy established Lorenzo as one of Italy's most influential political leaders, despite Florence's relatively small territorial extent. His negotiations prevented a general Italian war while creating alliance systems that preserved Florentine independence. Lorenzo's diplomatic skills earned him recognition as Italy's premier statesman and contributed to the period of relative peace that facilitated cultural achievements throughout the peninsula. Economic difficulties during Lorenzo's later years revealed the costs of extensive cultural patronage and political activities. The Medici Bank's resources were strained by loans to rulers who often delayed repayment, while competition from other banking houses reduced profit margins. Lorenzo's successors would inherit these financial problems along with the political and cultural achievements that had made the Medici name synonymous with Renaissance Florence. The expulsion of Piero de' Medici in 1494, following the French invasion, demonstrated how quickly political fortunes could change in Renaissance Italy. Piero lacked his father's political skills while facing challenges that exceeded those confronted by previous Medici rulers. His flight from Florence created opportunities for the Republican revival that would briefly restore traditional communal government under the influence of Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola's brief dominance of Florence from 1494 to 1498 represented a remarkable example of religious charisma, overturning established political arrangements. This Dominican friar attracted enormous popular support through sermons that promised divine punishment for corruption, while calling for moral reform and republican government. His Bonfire of the Vanities in 1497, which destroyed luxury goods and secular artworks, demonstrated the power of religious enthusiasm to challenge Renaissance cultural values. The conflict between Savonarola's moral reforms and Pope Alexander VI's political interests led to the friar's excommunication and eventual execution for heresy. Savonarola's death by burning in the Piazza della Signoria in 1498 ended the most serious challenge to Renaissance secular culture, while demonstrating the limits of religious authority when opposed by determined political forces. His martyrdom created a legacy of religious reform that would influence later Protestant movements. The return of the Medici to Florence in 1512 under papal and Spanish protection marked the beginning of their transformation from republican leaders to hereditary princes. Giovanni de' Medici's election as Pope Leo X in 1513 provided the family with resources and authority that enabled them to dominate Florentine politics without depending on popular support. The Pope's nephew became Duke of Florence, while other family members received high church offices and territorial grants. The assassination of Alessandro de' Medici in 1537 and the subsequent election of Cosimo I demonstrated the institutionalization of Medici power that had been established during the previous generation. Cosimo possessed neither direct descent from Lorenzo the Magnificent nor popular support among Florentines, yet he successfully consolidated ducal authority while expanding Florentine territory through the conquest of Siena. His reign marked Florence's transformation from Renaissance republic to early modern principality. Cultural patronage continued under the later Medici, though with different emphases that reflected changing political circumstances and artistic fashions. The Medici supported Counter-Reformation religious art while maintaining their traditional interest in classical scholarship. Their collections, which included manuscripts, sculptures, paintings, and scientific instruments, eventually formed the core of Florence's Uffizi Gallery, preserving Renaissance achievements for future generations. The Medici legacy in Florence extended far beyond their immediate political and cultural achievements to influence European development throughout the early modern period. Their banking innovations provided models for international finance, while their political techniques influenced princely government throughout Italy. Most importantly, their cultural patronage had created artistic and intellectual achievements that would inspire European civilization for centuries. The family that began as money changers had become the architects of Renaissance culture. Venice at its zenith. During the 15th century, the most serene Republic of Venice reached the pinnacle of its power and prosperity, creating a commercial empire that stretched from the Alps to the Black Sea, while developing governmental institutions that provided stability and effectiveness unmatched by any contemporary European state. The city's unique combination of maritime dominance, territorial expansion, constitutional sophistication, and cultural achievement made it one of Renaissance Europe's most distinctive and successful political entities. Venice's expansion onto the Italian mainland, known as the Terra Firma Conquest, transformed the Republic from a purely maritime power into a major territorial state during the first half of the 15th century. The acquisition of Padua in 1405 marked the beginning of systematic Venetian expansion westward across the Lombard plain. Subsequent conquests of Vicenza, Verona, and Brescia created a substantial territorial buffer that protected Venetian trade routes while providing agricultural resources and tax revenues to support the Republic's Mediterranean empire. The conquest of terra firma territories required fundamental changes in Venetian military organization and governmental structure. The Republic developed professional land forces to supplement its traditional naval supremacy, while creating administrative systems capable of governing diverse mainland populations. Venetian rule proved remarkably successful in integrating conquered territories through policies that preserved local autonomy while ensuring loyalty to the central government. Constitutional developments during the 15th century perfected the mixed government system that made Venice a model of political stability for contemporary observers. The complex electoral procedures that prevented corruption while ensuring competent leadership became increasingly sophisticated. The balance between the Doge's ceremonial authority, the Senate's deliberative functions, and the Council of Ten's executive powers provided effective governance while preventing the tyranny that afflicted many other Italian states. The Venetian nobility that governed the Republic developed into one of Europe's most distinctive political classes through the combination of commercial wealth, governmental experience, and cultural sophistication. Noble families maintained their status through successful participation in both trade and public service, while following social codes that emphasized civic virtue over personal advancement. This system produced leaders whose competence and integrity were recognized throughout Europe. Venice's Mediterranean empire reached its greatest extent during the 15th century through the acquisition of Cyprus in 1489 and the consolidation of control over strategic positions throughout the Aegean Sea. The island of Cyprus provided Venice with sugar plantations, cotton production, and a strategic base for eastern Mediterranean operations. The Republic's network of island bases and trading posts created a commercial empire that generated enormous revenues, while providing military security for Venetian merchants. The development of the Venetian arsenal during this period created the world's most advanced shipbuilding facility, capable of constructing vessels with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The arsenal employed over 3,000 skilled workers who used assembly line techniques that would not appear elsewhere until the Industrial Revolution. The facility could launch a completed galley every day during periods of intensive production, giving Venice decisive advantages in naval warfare and commercial competition. Venetian naval innovations during the 15th century included improvements in ship design, navigation techniques, and maritime law that influenced sailing practices throughout Europe. Venetian galleys combined speed, cargo capacity, and defensive capabilities in configurations that proved superior to competitors' vessels. The Republic's navigational expertise, accumulated through centuries of Mediterranean experience, enabled Venetian captains to maintain regular schedules and reach destinations that remained inaccessible to other European merchants. The expansion of Venetian commerce into the Atlantic Ocean during the late 15th century demonstrated the Republic's ability to adapt to changing geographical circumstances created by Portuguese and Spanish exploration. Venetian merchants established trading relationships with Atlantic ports while maintaining their traditional dominance in eastern Mediterranean markets. This geographical diversification helped Venice weather the economic disruptions caused by Portuguese discovery of sea routes to Asia. Diplomatic innovations developed by Venice during the 15th century established the Republic as Europe's most sophisticated diplomatic power. Venetian ambassadors were renowned for their intelligence gathering, negotiating skills, and ability to maintain good relationships with competing powers simultaneously. The Republic's diplomatic archives preserve detailed records of international relationships that provide modern historians with unprecedented insights into Renaissance political practices. The Venetian printing industry, which emerged during the late 15th century, built upon the Republic's commercial networks and cultural traditions to become Europe's most important centre for book production. Publishers like Aldus Manutius created beautiful editions of classical and contemporary works while developing new typefaces and publishing techniques. Venetian books were distributed throughout Europe while the industry provided employment for scholars, craftsmen, and merchants. Architectural achievements in 15th century Venice combined Byzantine traditions, Islamic influences, and Renaissance innovations to create unique syntheses that reflected the Republic's cosmopolitan culture. The Doge's Palace renovation completed during this period created one of Europe's most beautiful governmental buildings, while demonstrating Venetian wealth and artistic sophistication. Churches, palaces, and public buildings throughout the city showcased architectural styles that were distinctively Venetian, while incorporating international influences. The development of Venetian Renaissance painting during the 15th century produced artists whose work rivaled that of their Florentine contemporaries, while maintaining distinctive characteristics that reflected the Republic's maritime culture. Giovanni Bellini, Vittore Carpaccio, and other Venetian masters developed painting techniques that emphasized color, light, and atmospheric effects, rather than the linear precision favored in Florence. These artistic innovations would influence European painting for centuries. Social structure in Renaissance Venice differed significantly from other Italian cities due to the Republic's unique constitutional arrangements and commercial focus. The citizen nobility maintained political control while the cittadini class provided professional services and skilled craftsmanship. The popolani included workers in the arsenal, sailors, and other occupations essential to the Republic's maritime economy. This social system provided stability while allowing for limited mobility between classes. Economic innovations developed by Venetian merchants during the 15th century included new forms of insurance, banking practices, and accounting techniques that facilitated international commerce. The Republic's currency maintained consistent value through careful monetary policies that enhanced Venice's reputation for reliability. These financial innovations provided models that influenced commercial development throughout Europe, while generating profits that supported Venice's political and cultural achievements. Religious life in Renaissance Venice reflected the Republic's independence from papal authority while maintaining Orthodox Catholic practices. The Doge's role as head of the Venetian Church created potential conflicts with Rome that were generally resolved through diplomatic negotiation. The Republic's religious traditions emphasized civic ceremonies that reinforced political loyalty while maintaining spiritual devotion. This balance between religious and political authority contributed to Venice's stability and independence. Women's roles in Venetian society were influenced by the Republic's commercial culture and constitutional traditions. Noble women participated in family business activities while maintaining social positions that reflected their family's political status. Citizen women often worked in family enterprises or independent businesses, while enjoying greater legal protections than their counterparts in many other Italian cities. The Republic's stability and prosperity provided opportunities for female cultural patronage and intellectual activity. The decline of Venetian power during the 16th century resulted from changing international circumstances rather than internal failures. Portuguese discovery of sea routes to Asia reduced Venice's role as intermediary between European and Eastern markets. Ottoman expansion threatened Venetian territories in the Eastern Mediterranean. The rise of Atlantic powers shifted the center of European commerce away from the Mediterranean. Despite these challenges, Venice maintained its independence and much of its prosperity until the Napoleonic conquest ended the Republic's existence in 1797. Milan under the Sforza. The transformation of Milan from a troubled commune into one of Renaissance Europe's most powerful duchies under Francesco Sforza and his successors demonstrated how military skill, political acumen, and cultural patronage could create a major state from unpromising circumstances. The Sforza dynasty's rise from condottiero origins to ducal authority provided a model of successful state-building that influenced political development throughout Italy, while producing one of the Renaissance world's most magnificent courts. Francesco Sforza's path to power in Milan illustrated the opportunities available to talented individuals during the political upheavals of 15th century Italy. Born the illegitimate son of a condottiero, Francesco inherited military command of his father's professional army while still in his 20s. His marriage to Bianca Maria Visconti in 1441 provided him with claims to Milanese territory that he would later enforce through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic negotiation. The Siege of Milan from 1447 to 1450 demonstrated Francesco Sforza's strategic patience and political sophistication as he gradually wore down Republican resistance while avoiding actions that would provoke foreign intervention. The city had declared itself a republic following the death of the last Visconti Duke, but internal divisions and external pressures made effective governance impossible. Francesco's eventual entry into Milan was welcomed by citizens who preferred strong leadership to continued chaos. The consolidation of Sforza authority over the Milanese state required careful balancing of competing interests while establishing administrative systems capable of governing diverse territories. Francesco retained many existing governmental institutions while ensuring that key positions were filled by his supporters. His policies combined efficient taxation with respect for local traditions, creating governmental stability that had been lacking during the final years of Visconti rule. Economic revival under Sforza rule transformed Milan into northern Italy's most prosperous city, while creating the wealth necessary to support extensive military forces and cultural patronage. The duchy's strategic location at the intersection of Alpine trade routes provided opportunities for commercial expansion, while its fertile agricultural territories generated substantial tax revenues. Milanese manufacturers produced luxury goods that commanded high prices throughout Europe, while the city's banks financed international commerce. The Sforza court under Francesco and his immediate successors attracted artists, scholars, and diplomats from throughout Europe while maintaining the military efficiency that had established ducal power. Court ceremonies combined martial display with cultural sophistication, demonstrating the Duke's authority while showcasing Milanese artistic achievements. The balance between military and cultural activities reflected the dynasty's origins in professional warfare and its aspirations to legitimate princely authority. Galeazzo Maria Sforza, who ruled from 1466 to 1476, brought Sforza cultural patronage to unprecedented heights, while demonstrating the political instability that could result from arbitrary rule. His court became renowned for musical performances, theatrical productions, and architectural projects that rivaled those of any contemporary European ruler. However, his harsh treatment of political opponents and excessive taxation generated opposition that ultimately resulted in his assassination in 1476. The Regency government that ruled Milan during the minority of Galeazzo Maria's son demonstrated the institutional strength that the Sforza dynasty had created during its first generation of rule. Despite political challenges created by the Duke's assassination and succession difficulties, the Milanese state maintained its territorial integrity while continuing to play important roles in Italian and European politics. The Regency's success reflected the effectiveness of Sforza administrative innovations. Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro due to his dark complexion, represented the culmination of Sforza cultural achievement during his rule as regent and later as duke from 1481 to 1499. His court attracted Leonardo da Vinci, Bramante, and other Renaissance masters who created some of their most important works under Milanese patronage. Ludovico's cultural interest extended to engineering projects, urban planning, and scientific research that made Milan one of Europe's most innovative cities. The Last Supper, painted by Leonardo da Vinci in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie between 1495 and 1498, exemplified the artistic achievements made possible by Sforza patronage. This masterpiece demonstrated the synthesis of artistic skill, scientific knowledge, and cultural sophistication that characterized Renaissance Milan under Ludovico's rule. The painting's innovative techniques and psychological depth influenced European art for centuries, while establishing Leonardo's reputation as the Renaissance's greatest genius. Military innovations developed under Sforza patronage included improvements in artillery, fortification design, and cavalry tactics that influenced warfare throughout Europe. The duchy's armies combined traditional Italian military excellence with new technologies and organizational methods. Milanese military engineers designed fortifications that could withstand artillery bombardment, while developing weapons that proved superior to those of contemporary rivals. Ludovico's diplomatic policies demonstrated both the opportunities and dangers facing Italian rulers during the transition from medieval to early modern European politics. His invitation to French intervention in 1494 reflected calculations based on traditional Italian balance of power politics, rather than understanding of the new international situation created by emerging national monarchies. This miscalculation would ultimately destroy Sforza independence, while devastating Italian political autonomy. The French conquest of Milan in 1499 ended Sforza rule, while demonstrating the vulnerability of Italian states to foreign intervention despite their cultural achievements and economic prosperity. Ludovico's attempts to regain his duchy with Swiss and imperial assistance failed against French military superiority. His capture in 1500 and subsequent imprisonment in France symbolized the end of Italian political independence that his own policies had inadvertently helped to destroy. Economic consequences of the French conquest included disruption of trade networks, destruction of manufacturing facilities, and confiscation of ducal treasures that had been accumulated over generations of Sforza rule. The artistic collections assembled by Ludovico were dispersed throughout Europe, while many craftsmen and scholars fled to other courts seeking patronage. Milan's transformation from Renaissance capital to provincial city under foreign occupation illustrated the fragility of cultural achievement when political foundations were destroyed. The brief restoration of Sforza rule under Massimiliano and Francesco II during the early 16th century demonstrated both the persistence of dynastic loyalty and the impossibility of maintaining Italian independence against major European powers. These later Sforza dukes survived only through foreign protection, while exercising limited authority over territories that were effectively controlled by their Spanish and imperial patrons. Their reigns mark the transformation of Milan from an independent power to a client state. Cultural legacy of the Sforza period continued to influence European development long after the dynasty's political power had ended. The architectural innovations pioneered in Renaissance Milan provided models for palace and church construction throughout Europe. Scientific and engineering achievements sponsored by Sforza patronage contributed to the technological revolution that would transform European civilization during the early modern period. Most importantly, the artistic masterpieces created under Sforza rule remained to inspire future generations of artists and patrons. The integration of Milan into the Spanish Empire during the mid-16th century represented the final stage in the transformation from independent duchy to provincial territory within a European monarchy. Spanish rule provided stability and prosperity while eliminating the political independence that had enabled Sforza cultural achievements. The city that had once rivaled Florence and Venice as a centre of Renaissance innovation became a Spanish administrative centre whose former glories were preserved mainly in museums and historical memory. The Southern Kingdom, the southern Italian territories that comprised the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily during the 15th century, experienced their own distinctive renaissance under Aragonese rule, creating cultural achievements that combined Spanish, Italian, and Mediterranean influences while maintaining economic prosperity and political stability that contrasted sharply with the warfare that plagued northern Italy. This southern renaissance demonstrated how political unification could facilitate cultural development, while providing lessons about the relationship between foreign rule and local achievement. The Aragonese conquest of Naples, completed by Alfonso V in 1442, unified southern Italy under a single crown for the first time since the Norman period, while establishing connections to the broader Spanish Mediterranean Empire. Alfonso's long siege of Naples had required enormous resources and demonstrated his commitment to Italian territorial expansion. His victory provided Spain with a strategic foothold in central Mediterranean politics, while offering southern Italians the benefits of belonging to a major European monarchy. Alfonso the Magnanimous, as he became known, transformed Naples into one of Europe's most splendid Renaissance courts, through cultural patronage that attracted artists, scholars, and writers from throughout the Mediterranean world. His court combined Spanish ceremonial traditions with Italian humanist culture, while maintaining connections to the broader European Renaissance movement. The king's personal library became one of Europe's most important collections, while his architectural patronage transformed Naples into a showcase of Renaissance urban planning. The establishment of the University of Naples as a major centre of Renaissance learning demonstrated Alfonso's commitment to intellectual development while providing southern Italy with educational institutions that rivaled those of northern Italian cities. The university attracted students from throughout Europe while contributing to the revival of classical learning that characterized the Renaissance period. Its faculty included some of the era's most distinguished scholars in law, medicine, and the liberal arts. Economic prosperity under early Aragonese rule resulted from the kingdom's integration into Spanish Mediterranean trade networks, while maintaining traditional agricultural and manufacturing activities. Southern Italian ports became important stops for Spanish merchants trading with North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. Agricultural production increased through improved management of feudal estates, while manufacturing centres in Naples and other cities produced goods that were exported throughout Europe. The cultural synthesis achieved in Aragonese Naples combined Italian Renaissance innovations with Spanish and Mediterranean traditions to create distinctive artistic and intellectual achievements. Neapolitan painters developed styles that reflected both Flemish influences transmitted through Spanish connections and Italian Renaissance techniques learned from northern masters. Architecture combined Gothic Spanish elements with Renaissance Italian innovations, while maintaining characteristics that reflected the region's multicultural heritage. Literary achievements in 15th century southern Italy included both Latin humanist works that participated in the broader European Renaissance and vernacular literature that reflected local traditions and concerns. Neapolitan poets contributed to the development of Italian Renaissance literature while maintaining connections to Spanish and Catalan literary traditions. The court's international character facilitated cultural exchange that enriched southern Italian intellectual life. The reign of Ferrante III of 1458 to 1494 demonstrated both the achievements and limitations of Aragonese rule in southern Italy during the later 15th century. Ferrante successfully defended the kingdom against French invasion attempts while maintaining internal stability and continued cultural development. However, his increasingly autocratic rule and heavy taxation generated opposition among the feudal nobility that would complicate succession arrangements after his death. Social structure in the Aragonese kingdom reflected the region's feudal traditions while adapting to Renaissance political and cultural developments. The great feudal families that controlled vast estates maintained their traditional privileges while participating in court culture and administrative activities. Urban populations in Naples and other cities experienced economic growth and cultural opportunities, while rural populations remained largely bound to agricultural activities under feudal arrangements. Religious life in southern Italy combined Orthodox Catholic practices with distinctive local traditions that reflected the region's complex cultural heritage. The kingdom's churches contained architectural and artistic achievements that demonstrated the synthesis of Spanish, Italian, and Mediterranean influences under Aragonese patronage. Monastic communities continued their traditional roles in preserving learning while adapting to Renaissance educational and cultural developments. The French invasion of 1494 and subsequent wars for control of southern Italy disrupted the cultural and economic development that had characterized the early Aragonese period while demonstrating the kingdom's strategic importance in broader European conflicts. The kingdom's wealth and strategic position made it a coveted prize for competing European powers, while its internal divisions provided opportunities for foreign intervention. These conflicts would dominate southern Italian history for the next several decades. The establishment of Spanish viceregal rule during the early 16th century marked the end of independent southern Italian political development while integrating the region into the broader Spanish Empire. The viceroys who governed Naples combined administrative efficiency with respect for local traditions, providing stable government while ensuring that the kingdom's resources supported broader Spanish imperial policies. This arrangement proved remarkably durable, lasting until the 18th century. Cultural developments under Spanish rule demonstrated how foreign political control could coexist with continued local achievement in arts and learning. Neapolitan artists and scholars maintained connections to broader European cultural movements while developing distinctive styles that reflected their region's unique position within the Spanish Empire. The kingdom's universities and academies continued to attract international attention while contributing to European intellectual development. Economic integration into the Spanish Empire provided southern Italy with access to American markets and resources, while maintaining traditional Mediterranean trade relationships. Neapolitan merchants participated in Spanish Atlantic commerce, while the kingdom's agricultural products found ready markets throughout the Spanish territories. This economic expansion supported continued cultural development, while demonstrating the benefits that could result from belonging to a major European empire. The transition from Aragonese to Habsburg rule during the early 16th century completed southern Italy's integration into the Spanish imperial system, while preserving many of the cultural and administrative institutions that had developed during the previous century. The new rulers maintained the balance between central authority and local autonomy that had characterized successful Aragonese governance, while adapting administrative practices to meet the needs of a global empire. Women's roles in southern Italian Renaissance society reflected both Spanish and Italian influences, while maintaining characteristics that distinguished them from patterns common in northern Italy. Noble women participated in court culture while exercising significant influence over family estates and business activities. The kingdom's relative stability provided opportunities for female cultural patronage and intellectual activity that contributed to the region's Renaissance achievements. The legacy of the southern Italian Renaissance extended beyond immediate political boundaries to influence Mediterranean cultural development, while providing models for the relationship between foreign rule and local achievement. The cultural synthesis achieved under Aragonese patronage demonstrated how political unification could facilitate artistic and intellectual development while preserving regional characteristics. These achievements would continue to influence southern Italian culture throughout the early modern period, providing foundations for later cultural developments that maintained the region's distinctive character within the broader framework of European civilization. Cultural and intellectual revolution. The 15th century witnessed a fundamental transformation in European intellectual life as Italian scholars, artists, and inventors created new approaches to learning, artistic expression, and technological innovation that would reshape Western civilization. This cultural revolution, which contemporaries called a rebirth of ancient wisdom, and modern observers term the Renaissance, emerged from the synthesis of recovered classical texts, innovative artistic techniques, revolutionary technologies, and new educational methods that established Italy as Europe's cultural leader for centuries to come. The humanist movement that began with Petrarch reached full maturity during the 15th century as scholars throughout Italy developed systematic approaches to classical learning that emphasized the dignity and potential of human beings while maintaining Christian religious commitments. Humanist educators like Guarino da Verona and Vittorino da Feltre created new pedagogical methods that combined classical literary study with practical skills needed for civic and professional life. Their schools attracted students from throughout Europe while establishing educational standards that would influence European learning for centuries. The recovery and translation of Greek texts during the 15th century provided European scholars with access to classical works that had been unknown in the West for over a millennium. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated this process, as Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, bringing manuscripts and knowledge that had been preserved in the Eastern Empire. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino translated the complete works of Plato for the first time, revolutionizing European philosophical thought while establishing foundations for Renaissance Neoplatonism. The invention of printing with movable type during the mid-15th century transformed the dissemination of knowledge while making books accessible to broader segments of European society. Italian cities, particularly Venice and Florence, became major centers of printing that produced beautiful editions of classical and contemporary works. Publishers like Aldus Manutius in Venice developed new typefaces and production techniques while creating international distribution networks that spread Renaissance ideas throughout Europe. Artistic innovations during the 15th century established new standards for European painting, sculpture, and architecture that would influence creative expression for centuries. The development of linear perspective by Brunelleschi and its application by painters like Masaccio created unprecedented realism in visual representation. The revival of classical architectural forms in works like Brunelleschi's dome for Florence Cathedral demonstrated how ancient principles could be adapted to contemporary needs while creating structures of lasting beauty and engineering significance. Scientific and technological developments during this period laid foundations for the scientific revolution that would transform European understanding of natural phenomena during the 16th and 17th centuries. Leonardo da Vinci's systematic observations of human anatomy, plant growth, water flow, and mechanical principles demonstrated new approaches to investigating natural phenomena through direct observation and experimentation. His notebooks, filled with detailed drawings and explanations, provided models for scientific methodology that would influence later investigators. The patronage system that supported Renaissance cultural development reflected the growing wealth and sophistication of Italian urban society, while creating new relationships between artists and their sponsors. Wealthy merchants, successful professionals, and governmental officials commissioned works of art and literature while supporting scholars and inventors. This patronage created opportunities for cultural creativity, while ensuring that intellectual and artistic achievements reflected the values and interests of their supporters. University development during the 15th century provided institutional foundations for the cultural changes that were transforming European intellectual life. Italian universities expanded their curricula to include humanist subjects while maintaining traditional programs in law, medicine, and theology. New institutions were established while existing ones attracted students from throughout Europe, making Italy the continent's educational centre while contributing to the international spread of Renaissance ideas. Literary achievements during the 15th century demonstrated the maturity of vernacular Italian, while establishing new standards for European poetry and prose. Writers like Angelo Poliziano combined classical learning with contemporary concerns to create works that appealed to both scholarly and popular audiences. The development of Renaissance epic poetry and works like Boiardo's Orlando Innamorato provided models that would influence European literature for centuries, while demonstrating the expressive capabilities of modern languages. Architectural innovations during this period established principles of Renaissance design that would influence European building throughout the early modern period. Architects like Leon Battista Alberti developed theoretical works that systematized classical architectural principles while adapting them to contemporary needs and materials. Their buildings combined beauty, functionality, and engineering sophistication, while demonstrating the synthesis of theoretical knowledge and practical skill that characterized Renaissance achievement. Musical developments during the 15th century established new forms of composition and performance that enhanced Renaissance court culture while influencing European musical development for generations. Italian composers developed polyphonic techniques that created unprecedented complexity and emotional expression while maintaining the clarity and balance that characterized Renaissance artistic ideals. The establishment of court chapels and musical academies provided institutional support for continued innovation. The development of Renaissance political thought during this period created new approaches to governmental theory and practice that would influence European political development throughout the early modern period. Humanist scholars like Leonardo Bruni developed Republican political theory, while Machiavelli's later works would provide systematic analysis of effective governance under contemporary conditions. These theoretical developments reflected practical experience with diverse forms of government, while contributing to broader European understanding of political possibilities. Medical advances during the 15th century combined recovery of classical medical texts with systematic anatomical research that improved European understanding of human physiology, while providing foundations for later scientific medicine. Italian physicians conducted systematic dissections that corrected errors in ancient medical texts, while developing new approaches to diagnosis and treatment. Their work contributed to the gradual development of medical science as a discipline based on observation and experiment rather than traditional authority. Engineering achievements during this period demonstrated the synthesis of theoretical knowledge and practical skill that characterized Renaissance technology. Italian engineers developed new techniques for construction, hydraulics, and military fortification that proved superior to traditional methods while providing models for later technological development. Their innovations contributed to the technological superiority that would enable European expansion and dominance during the early modern period. The internationalization of Renaissance culture during the late 15th century spread Italian innovations throughout Europe, while adapting them to local conditions and traditions. Foreign scholars came to Italy to study, while Italian artists and intellectuals traveled throughout Europe sharing their knowledge and skills. This cultural exchange enriched both Italian and foreign traditions while establishing foundations for the broader European Renaissance that would characterize the 16th century. Educational reforms implemented during the 15th century created new approaches to learning that emphasized practical skills alongside traditional academic subjects, while preparing students for active participation in contemporary society. Renaissance educators developed curricula that combined classical learning with modern languages, mathematics, and natural philosophy, while encouraging independent thought and creative expression. These educational innovations provided foundations for the intellectual developments that would transform European civilization during the early modern period. Conclusion: the medieval legacy. As the 15th century drew to a close and foreign armies marched across Italian soil, the medieval chapter of the peninsula's history reached its end. Yet this conclusion was also a beginning, for the 1,000 years between the fall of Rome and the dawn of the Renaissance had created the cultural, political, and economic foundations that would make Italy the birthplace of modern European civilization. The political fragmentation that had characterized medieval Italy, often viewed as a weakness that invited foreign conquest, had actually fostered the diversity and innovation that became the Italian genius. The competing city-states of Florence, Venice, Milan, and their neighbours had created laboratories of governmental experimentation where republican institutions, professional bureaucracies, and diplomatic innovations could develop free from the constraints of unified monarchy. These political achievements provided models that would influence European development for centuries. Economic innovations pioneered during Italy's medieval centuries established the foundations of modern capitalism while creating the wealth necessary to support unprecedented cultural achievement. Italian merchants had developed banking practices, accounting methods, and commercial law that facilitated international trade throughout Europe and beyond. Their cities had become manufacturing centres whose products were prized from London to Constantinople, while their agricultural innovations had supported population growth and urbanisation that exceeded levels achieved elsewhere in medieval Europe. Cultural synthesis had been medieval Italy's greatest achievement. Successive waves of invaders and influences, Germanic, Byzantine, Islamic, and Northern European, had been absorbed and transformed into distinctive Italian traditions. The Italian language that emerged from this synthesis provided the vehicle for Dante's Divine Comedy and the foundation for Renaissance literature. Italian art and architecture had developed from this multicultural heritage to create distinctive styles that combined classical principles with contemporary innovations. Religious developments in medieval Italy had profoundly influenced European Christianity, while creating institutions that would shape Western civilization for millennia. The temporal power of the papacy, developed during struggles with imperial authority, had established the principle that spiritual values could challenge secular power while providing moral leadership for European society. Italian monasticism had preserved classical learning through the darkest periods while developing agricultural and educational innovations that contributed to European recovery and expansion. The university system that emerged in medieval Italian cities had created new approaches to learning that combined classical texts with contemporary observation and analysis. These institutions had trained the lawyers, physicians, and administrators who governed medieval society while preserving and transmitting the intellectual heritage that would inspire Renaissance achievement. Italian legal scholarship had rediscovered and adapted Roman law to create governmental and commercial systems that provided order and predictability in an age of constant change. Technological and scientific developments in medieval Italy had laid foundations for the innovations that would transform European society during the early modern period. Italian engineers had developed architectural techniques, hydraulic systems, and mechanical devices that demonstrated the practical applications of theoretical knowledge. Their military innovations had influenced warfare throughout Europe, while their maritime technology had enabled commercial expansion that connected European markets with Asian and African sources of wealth. The social changes that occurred during Italy's medieval centuries had created new forms of organization that emphasized individual merit alongside traditional family and community ties. The guild system had provided frameworks for economic cooperation while maintaining standards of quality and fairness. Urban governments had developed new concepts of citizenship that balanced individual rights with community responsibilities. These social innovations had provided models for European development while establishing principles that would influence modern democratic institutions. Women's roles in medieval Italian society, while remaining limited by contemporary standards, had evolved in ways that provided greater opportunities for participation in economic, cultural, and religious activities. Italian cities had produced female artists, writers, and religious leaders whose achievements demonstrated the potential for expanded roles that would develop further during the Renaissance period. The relative prosperity and stability of Italian urban society had created conditions that facilitated these developments, while providing models for other European regions. The cultural achievements that crowned medieval Italian development, the works of Dante, Giotto, and their contemporaries, had established new standards for European artistic and intellectual expression, while demonstrating the potential for vernacular culture to achieve the dignity previously associated only with classical antiquity. These achievements had prepared the ground for the Renaissance flowering that would make Italy the cultural leader of European civilization during the 15th and 16th centuries. As Italian independence ended with foreign conquest during the 1490s, the medieval heritage provided resources for cultural and intellectual achievement that would continue despite political subjugation. The traditions of learning, artistic excellence, and innovative thinking that had developed during the medieval centuries would inspire continued creativity, while influencing European development throughout the early modern period and beyond. Medieval Italy's greatest legacy was the demonstration that human societies could achieve remarkable cultural and intellectual heights through the synthesis of diverse traditions, the encouragement of individual creativity, and the development of institutions that balanced order with freedom. The peninsula that had once been the heart of the Roman Empire had created new forms of civilization that would inspire and influence human development for centuries to come, proving that endings could also be beginnings, and that the collapse of old orders could create opportunities for achievements that surpassed even the glories of the past. In the quiet hills of Tuscany, along the canals of Venice, and in the bustling streets of Milan, the medieval legacy lived on, waiting to inspire new generations of artists, thinkers, and dreamers who would carry the Italian contribution to human civilization into the modern world and beyond. The medieval chapter had ended, but the story it had begun would continue to unfold across the centuries, enriching human experience and demonstrating the eternal capacity for renewal and achievement that had made Italy one of history's most enduring sources of inspiration and wonder.